She was 32 and broke. No lease, no family key, no place to return to, just a canvas duffel bag, and $117 she had folded into an envelope from her last motel receipt. And with that amount, she bought a weathered relay station near Sand Springs in Churchill County, Nevada, a place that had fallen off county maps after 1898. The east wall leaned hard enough to cast a crooked shadow. 3 windows were boarded, and the roof had opened to birds. He lifted one hand brief as a blessing, and then carried her little suitcase as if it contained glass. Those weekends were made of rituals. He cooked eggs in a black skillet and warmed tortillas directly over the flame until they puffed and charred at the edges. He read the newspaper without comment, circling cattle prices and weather reports with a carpenter's pencil. Then, when the dishes were done and the house had settled into its morning sounds, he unlocked the shed. Inside, and hung her towel from a nail for privacy when the wind allowed it. The pit below was dry, which was a mercy. Dryness ruled the desert with a hard but useful hand. For 3 days she learned the building by need rather than by curiosity. She learned which plank near the front wall would take her weight and which one bent with a soft warning under the ball of her foot. She learned that the back room stayed colder until noon, while the front room caught light in narrow ribbons through the boarded windows. She learned that the east corner dripped only when frost thawed along the roof tin. She placed a coffee can under it and listened to the drops gather through the afternoon, one pause, then a sudden quickened tapping when the sun struck the metal seam. She carried debris outside in slow loads, bird nests from the hearth, broken plaster, shreds of burlap, rusted cans, a strip of harness leather chewed nearly through by mice. She sorted everything on a flat stone near the door because she had no right yet to throw away what might explain the room. Useful, burnable, broken beyond use. Unknown. The unknown pile grew largest. On the second day, she found a square nail with a hand-hammered head, blackened but straight. On the third, a porcelain button no larger than a bean. Under the workbench, she discovered 3 flakes of old red paint and a piece of blue glass worn soft at the edges, as if it had spent years tumbling in dry earth. She kept these in a chipped saucer on the bench, small witnesses to an ordinary life that had not expected to become history. The floor spoke differently in each room. Near the hearth, it gave a brittle crackle where sand had worked between boards. By the door, it thudded dull over packed earth. Around the mochila rack, the planks made a tighter sound, higher and firmer, though she did not yet give that difference a name. She was too busy learning how to keep the wind outside and the water from freezing before morning. By the 4th day, hunger made the walk into Fallon feel shorter than it was. She left at dawn with the deed envelope inside her coat and reached town near noon, the cold sharpening her face until the cafe windows looked almost holy with steam. She did not go in. She counted her coins behind the post office, bought flour beans, salt, 2 potatoes, and a small tin of lard from the market, then stood for several minutes outside Morris Hardware. The front windows were crowded with things a person might need if the world had been reduced to boards, fire rope, and repair. Lantern wicks, stove bolts, axe handles, galvanized buckets, sash cord, masonry brushes, chimney rods tied in bundles. A hand-lettered sign read, "Weather strip before the wind does it for you." Inside the store smelled of oiled wood, metal filings, kerosene coffee, and cardboard. The man behind the counter was tall and narrow, with a white beard trimmed close under his jaw and a red mark across the bridge of his nose where his glasses sat. His left hand was missing the tip of the ring finger. He moved without hurry among the shelves, and when he looked at Rosalinda's coat shoes and chapped hands, his eyes did not linger there long enough to make shame useful. "Morning," he said, though it was afternoon by the wall clock. "Morning." "What are you fixing?" She could have said nothing. She could have asked the price of nails and left. But practical questions require honest ground beneath them. The Sand Springs station. The man's hand stopped on a box of stove bolts. County finally sold it. "Yes, sir." To you, yes, sir. He set the box down with care. My name is Everett Morris. My father opened this place. His father sold mule shoes out of a wagon before there was a counter to stand behind. He leaned both palms on the wood. That building will try to spend you before it shelters you. I believe that. What comes first? The chimney. He nodded once as if she had passed a test he had not announced. Good. Roof will shout, but chimney will kill you quiet. Rosalinda placed her list on the counter. She had written it at night by the light of a candle stub found in the back room, each item chosen after touching the station's failures with her own hands. Everett read it without expression. 6 feet of stovepipe wire, 1 stiff chimney brush, 6-inch, 2 fiberglass rods, work gloves, masonry trowel, cold chisel, hammer, dust mask, matches, lantern wick, kerosene 1 quart, 10 pounds common nails, 2 pounds 8 penny finish nails, 1 roll tar paper if affordable. Everything had a place. All stood upright in a drilled block of pine. Edge bevelers lay in a canvas roll tied with braided cord. Half-moon knives hung from nails above the bench. Their curved blades honed so bright they seemed less like tools than sections of cold water. There were jars of copper rivets, harness needles, buckles darkened with age, spools of waxed linen thread, and mallets with rawhide heads worn pale from use. Rosalinda was not allowed to touch anything at first. 1 small bag, mortar mix. 1 tin, wood stove, cement if necessary. He looked up at her. Cash, some. How much is some? She told him. He turned the paper over and began writing numbers. Chimney brush, $2.95. Rods, $1.20 each. Work gloves, $1.10. Trowel, 89 cents. Chisel, 75. Hammer, $1.40. Dust mask, 25 cents. Matches, 12. Wick, 19. Kerosene, 38. Nails by weight, $1.06. Mortar, $1.50. Stove cement, 69. The total sat at $15.18 before tar paper. Rosalinda looked at the figure and felt the edge of it press against the food money in her coat. Everett drew a line through the total. You have an account now. I cannot guarantee when I can pay. I did not ask for a guarantee. I do not want charity. It is not charity if I write it down. He tapped the paper with his pencil. That makes it credit. Credit means I expect you to return. She studied his face, searching for the part where the cost hid. He reached under the counter and pulled out a yellowed paperback manual with a cracked spine. The cover showed a man in a plaid shirt smiling beside a wood stove, as if soot and carbon monoxide were problems solved by optimism. My wife bought this in 1968, Everett said. Read the chimney chapter twice, then read it once more because the first 2 times you will think you understood it. How much for that? He slid the manual toward her. Nothing. It has been wrong about plumbing for 15 years, but the chimney chapter is decent. He packed the supplies in a burlap feed sack and tied the top with twine. Before she lifted it, he added 2 things, a bent but usable wire brush and a stub of carpenter's pencil. Write down what the building tells you, he said. Most rot is a confession. The walk back took the rest of the day. The feed sack bit into one shoulder, then the other. The chimney rods knocked against her hip. Once along the road beyond the last cottonwood row, she had to stop and laugh without sound, because the whole arrangement was so ungainly, so insufficient, so plainly unequal to the miles ahead. Then she lifted it again. By the time she reached the station, the sky had gone violet at the lower edge. The chimney waited in the cold. She began the next morning. First, she cleared the hearth completely, removing nests with a stick, then broken brick, then a hardened mass of soot and feather and wind-blown grit that had settled just beyond the damper. The smell was sharp and bitter, older than any fire she had ever lit. Creosote, coated the upper throat in black scales, glossy in places, dull and flaky in others. When she touched it with the chisel, it broke away in curved plates like burned bark. The manual instructed her to work from the top down if possible. Possible was a dangerous word. She studied the roof from outside and decided that climbing it alone would be a kind of arrogance the building might punish. Instead, she tied the brush to the first fiberglass rod, then another, then worked upward from the firebox, pushing, twisting, withdrawing, tapping the rod to loosen soot. The first shower of black dust came down over her sleeves, hair and face. The dust mask helped until sweat dampened it, and every breath tasted of ash. She worked in intervals. 20 minutes brushing. 10 minutes clearing debris. 5 minutes outside to breathe. Back inside. Again. The rods flexed and knocked inside the flue. Twice the brush lodged where bricks had shifted. She did not yank. She rotated the rod gently, feeling for release the way Abuelito had taught her to free a needle caught in dense leather without tearing the grain. By noon, she had filled half a bucket with creosote flakes, soot twigs, and the skeleton of a bird so delicate it seemed impossible it had once flown against wind. She buried the bones under a sagebrush outside, because leaving them in the trash pile felt careless. The second stage was inspection. With the mirror from her duffel angled in the firebox and sunlight reflected from a scrap of tin, she examined what she could see: missing mortar, hairline cracks, a shelf of compacted soot near the bend. She used the cold chisel to loosen it, then the wire brush to scrub until brick showed in dull red patches. The work took 8 hours the first day and 4 the next. Her arms trembled afterward. Soot settled into the creases around her nails and would not wash out in cold water. On the third day, she mixed a small amount of mortar in the coffee can, wetter than bread dough, but stiff enough to hold on the trowel. She patched only what she could reach safely from below. For nearly a year, she sat on an upturned nail keg while Abuelito cut skeeve, dampened, marked, and stitched. He spoke seldom, but he narrated with movement. The way his thumb settled behind a blade. The way he held a strap to the light before trusting it. The way he paused after wetting a piece of leather, waiting for the darkened surface to return halfway toward its natural color before tooling. Leather has memory, he told her one November morning, pressing mortar into open joints and smoothing it with one finger wrapped in cloth. The manual warned against large repairs without proper access. She obeyed. There was courage in repair, but there was no virtue in pretending a broken chimney had become new because she needed it to. She waited another day before the first fire. Waiting was difficult because the cold had begun to occupy her bones like a tenant. At dusk, she laid a fire no larger than both hands. Twigs first, splinters shaved from a dry board, a twist of newspaper saved from the library, 3 pieces of weathered lean-to wood, no thicker than her wrist. She opened the damper as far as it would go and crouched with matches cupped against the draft. The paper caught. Flame moved carefully through the splinters, orange at the base and blue where resin remained in the wood. Smoke gathered, hesitated, and for one breath she felt the old fear rise. Then the chimney drew. The smoke lifted into the throat, pulled upward with a steady inward sound. Rosalinda stayed crouched until her knees hurt. The first heat did not fill the room. It touched her face, then her hands, then the front of her coat. That was enough. She fed the fire one piece at a time, never more than the flue could take. The station's shadows retreated in small increments. For supper, she boiled beans that had soaked all afternoon in a coffee can near the hearth. She added salt, half a potato, and a spoon of lard. The smell filled the front room with the honest plainness of food becoming possible. She ate from the can with a pocket knife because she had not yet found a spoon worth trusting. Steam dampened her upper lip. Her hands stopped shaking before the beans were gone. That night, she slept 4 feet from the hearth and woke twice to feed the coals. By the end of the first week, The front room had begun to answer work with evidence. She made a list on the back of Everett's store receipt, then transferred it to the inside cover of the manual. Front room hearth usable with caution. Door wired, not repaired. North window boarded tight. South window boarded poorly. Floor planks uneven near entry. Rack stable. East wall lean visible but not shifting under hand pressure. Roof hole active at thaw. Back room bench upright. Forge pan cracked. Tin hood rusted through at upper seam. One barrel broken. Horseshoe fragments 9. Square nails 23. One draw knife handle without blade. One wooden peg rail empty. One iron hook intact. One burlap scrap with red thread along edge. One tobacco tin empty. One lantern frame, no glass. One cracked stoneware jar with hardened substance inside, likely tallow or grease. She did not hurry the inventory. She lifted every object, turned it, smelled it, when smell might matter, and placed it where it would not be stepped on. The back room held no treasure in the way stories often promise treasure. It held labor abandonment and the remains of decisions made by people who had expected to come back tomorrow. A nail dropped into a crack. A strap cut and discarded. A jar pushed against the wall and forgotten. The station had not been emptied in one grand departure. It had been thinned by years, weather animals, scavengers, and official neglect. On the 8th day, she found the first anomaly. It was not visual. She was sweeping near the mochila rack, working dust from between planks, with the stiff wire brush Everett had given her when the broom handle slipped from her hand and struck the floor upright. The sound was higher than she expected. Not hollow exactly. Held. She tapped the same board again. Then the one beside it. The difference was slight, the sort of difference a hurried person would have folded into the general complaint of an aged floor. Rosalinda crouched and pressed her ear near the planks. Wind moved outside. The sign tapped. Somewhere in the back room, a mouse scratched inside the wall. She waited until the station settled. Tap. Tap. The first board gave a dry thud over earth. The second returned a tighter knock, as if something lay beneath it with a surface of its own. She marked the board with the carpenter's pencil. Then she walked away. For the rest of the day, she did other work. She patched the lower door gap with folded burlap. She moved the burnable pile farther from the wall. She sorted the horseshoe fragments by shape, though she had no reason for doing so. Each time she passed the rack, her eyes went to the pencil mark. The next morning, she tested again. This time, she used weight. She placed one foot on the marked plank and shifted slowly. The board did not flex like its neighbors. It held firm at both ends, but in the middle it gave one faint movement, not downward, but against something. She knelt with the utility knife and worked dust from the seam. When fog pressed against the shed windows and the grape leaves had gone black at the edges. You cannot bully it into becoming honest. She was 10 then, too young to understand the sentence, but old enough to keep it. Years later, when she had been handed forms to sign rooms to leave apologies that were not apologies, she would remember the way he said honest. Not good. Not pretty. Honest. A saddle, he explained, could be decorated until it looked fit for a parade. The nails were old hand-cut, their heads dark and square. Most floorboards had 2 nails at each joist. This one had 3 near the southern end, and the middle nail was not iron. It was wood. A small cedar disc stained nearly the color of the plank had been pressed into a bored hole where a nail head should have been. She would have missed it without the wire brush. Even then, it looked more like a knot than a plug. Rosalinda sat back on her heels. The room seemed to listen with her. She did not pry at once. She made coffee first because impatience had ruined more work than poverty ever had. She drank it black, sitting on the floor with the manual open beside her, though she was not reading. Then she gathered what tools she owned: utility knife, hammer, cold chisel, the bent wire brush, and an awl from her cheap kit that had never felt right in her hand. The cedar plug came free in pieces. Under it was the head of a screw, not modern but slotted and blackened with age. She cleaned the slot with the awl and turned it with the utility knife blade because she had no proper screwdriver. The screw resisted, then moved with a dry complaint. Another plug sat at the other end of the plank, then another under dust near the rack post. 3 plugs, 3 screws, 3 hidden decisions. When the last screw lifted, the board did not come up. It had settled into its place over many seasons and did not intend to surrender because a stranger had found the fasteners. Rosalinda worked the chisel into the seam 1/4 inch at a time, padding the edge with leather scrap so she would not chew the plank apart. She lifted, rested, shifted, lifted again. Dust cracked along the seam. A strip of dry mud fell into the darkness below. At last the board rose. Beneath it was not open space but packed earth, tamped hard and level with a rectangular depression lined by stones. In that depression sat a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Beside it lay 2 longer bundles tied in cord and covered with burlap darkened by age. A smell rose from the opening, sealed and mineral, with a faint sweetness like old wax and cured hide. Rosalinda did not touch anything for several minutes. She looked toward the door, though no one was there. She looked at the rack. She looked at her own hands, blackened from chimney soot, cracked at the knuckles, the nails broken short by work. Then she reached down. The first bundle was heavier than it looked. The burlap crackled but did not fall apart. She carried it to the hearth where afternoon light came across the floor and untied the cord. Inside was a stack of tanned cowhides, folded carefully, flesh side inward, each piece separated by a sheet of brown paper. She expected stiffness. Instead, when she lifted one corner, the leather bent with a slow-living suppleness that made her throat close. It had been kept dry. Someone had known how to protect it. Someone had trusted the desert's lack of mercy to become a form of preservation. The hides were pale russet, darker, near the folded edges, with the smell of smoked tannin and thyme. No mouse had reached them. No roof leak had found them. They lay in her hands like work interrupted, but not lost. The second bundle held a leather roll tied with a narrow strap. The roll itself was cracked at the outside, but sound within. Rosalinda untied it and opened each flap across the floor. Tool pockets appeared dark against dark, the shapes inside clear, before the objects were lifted. An awl with a bone handle, yellowed and smooth from use. A stitching clamp, compact and hand-shaped, its jaws lined with worn leather. An edger, bright along the working curve where oil had held back rust. A half-moon knife, wrapped in cloth, its blade darkened but whole, its bone grip fitted to a hand that had been gone longer than anyone living could remember. There were harness needles tucked into a small sleeve, a creaser with a handle repaired in black thread, and a little block of beeswax wrapped in paper that had gone translucent around the edges. Each tool bore the marks of use rather than display. Scratches, polish, tiny repairs, honest wear. Rosalinda lifted the awl. It fit her palm differently from the cheap one she had carried for years. Not better, because it was old, but better because someone had shaped it through work until hand and handle had come to agreement. She turned it once in the light. Near the base, almost hidden by grime, were 3 scratched initials. T.I. She set it down carefully. The tin box remained. It was rectangular, lead-lined by the weight of it, with soldered seams and a lid sealed under a strip of dark wax. The oilcloth around it had hardened where it folded at the corners. But if the tree pinched the horse, if the stitching failed under weather, if the maker hurried where patience was required, then beauty became a kind of lie. He taught her to case leather with a sponge, not soak it like laundry. He showed her how to pull thread through beeswax and twist 2 needles through one hole so the seam locked on itself. He placed scrap pieces in front of her, and let her ruin them without rescue. Her first borderline wandered like a creek in loose sand. Rosalinda carried it to the bench and wiped the top with her sleeve. There was no keyhole, only 2 metal clasps and a band of wax pressed with an oval mark so worn she could not read it. She broke the wax with the utility knife. The lid lifted reluctantly, then opened with a soft inward breath. Inside lay a leather pouch, a stack of paper money wrapped in twine, a smaller cloth purse, and a ribboned object dark with tarnish. At the bottom, folded once, was a letter. She did not open the letter. Not then. Instead, she began with the money, because money was the least mysterious and the most dangerous if imagination touched it before fact did. The stack of paper notes consisted of silver certificates, most worn but intact, some bearing dates from years she had only seen in history books. $1, $5, $10, a few $20 notes folded together at the center. She counted slowly, laying each denomination in a separate pile on the bench. The paper money came to $600. She counted again. Then the cloth purse. Inside were coins wrapped in a strip of muslin, Morgan silver dollars worn smooth at Liberty's cheek, Barber $half dark at the rim, Indian head cents, 3 Liberty nickels, and 2 dimes so thin the dates had nearly vanished. The coin total came to $11.64. $611.64. She wrote the number on Everett's receipt, then sat with the pencil in her hand and stared at it. It was not fortune. Not in the way people dreamed of fortune when they were hungry. It would not build a new roof, settle taxes forever, or erase the cold from the room. But inside that box in metal and paper and intent was enough to change the order of her next choices. Enough to buy time. Enough to keep from selling the tools before she understood them. Enough to say no to one form of desperation. The ribboned object was not jewelry as she first thought. It was a medal, dull bronze beneath tarnish, suspended from a faded ribbon. On one side was an eagle wing spread. On the other, lettering she cleaned gently with a corner of her shirt until the date appeared. Below it, in smaller letters, were words naming service in the Spanish-American War. The name on the rim was not one she knew, though the last name was Ibarra. Ibarra. The first initial could have belonged to a brother, a cousin, a son, a man who had left the desert for another kind of heat and never fully returned. She laid the medal apart from the money. The leather pouch held the folded letter, and beneath it 3 small objects, a brass key forged from a horseshoe nail, its bow hammered into an uneven oval, a weathered Pony Express mochila buckle, engraved with October 24th, 1861, and a second folded scrap of paper containing nothing but a craft mark drawn in ink, a crescent blade above a needle. Rosalinda touched the buckle last. The engraving was rough hand done, not decorative, so much as insistent. The last relay ride. The last day. October 24th, 1861. She had no proof yet that this was what it meant, but the date stood there with the authority of a closed door. The letter remained on the bench through the evening. She built a small fire. She boiled beans. She washed her hands twice, then a third time, but soot and leather oil remained in the cracks of her skin. The open tools lay on one side of the hearth, the hides rewrapped but not hidden again. The money returned to the tin box because leaving it exposed felt indecent. The medal rested on the manual catching firelight along one worn edge. At first she told herself she was waiting for better light, then for a calmer mind, then for morning. The truth was simpler. The letter frightened her more than the money, more than the tools, more than the sudden knowledge that the station had been keeping a secret under her feet while she slept. Money could be counted. Tools could be cleaned. Leather could be assessed by grain moisture scars and strength. A letter could reach out of 1 century and place a hand on the living. She was not ready for that hand. Near midnight she put on her coat and carried the water bottle outside. The desert had gone clear and hard under stars. Cold lifted from the ground in a steady breath. The station behind her looked smaller by moonlight, its damaged roof and leaning wall held in silver rather than judgment. Beyond the rise, the wash lay pale and dry. The cottonwoods stood without leaves, each branch exact against the sky. She walked to the spring line and stood listening. The water moved in the dark, hidden by grass and roots, making a sound so modest it could have been missed by anyone crossing too fast. It did not rush. It did not announce itself. It continued. Her first flower stamp was too deep on one side and barely visible on the other. He inspected each mistake with an expression so grave she feared she had injured him. Then he slid another scrap across the bench. Again. By 14, she could cut a straight strap with a draw gauge. By 16, she could mend a cracked billet well enough that Abuelito kept it instead of throwing it into the burn box. By 18, she understood that the shed was not just a workshop. Rosalinda crouched and filled the bottle. Her hands went numb before it was full. She held them under her arms and looked back toward the station, where one thin line of firelight showed through a gap beside the door. Inside were tools with bone handles, hides kept supple through decades of dryness, coins and certificates, a medal with a date from a war not yet explained, and a letter folded by someone who had expected another pair of hands to find it after silence had done its long work. She stayed outside until the cold made the decision for her. Then she returned, fastened the wire through the door strap, and lay down beside the hearth without opening the letter. The tin box rested near her shoulder. The half-moon knife lay wrapped again in cloth. Under the replaced plank, the earth waited with the clean rectangular mark of what it had kept. Some trails are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. Morning came without warmth, but it came clean. Rosalinda woke to a blue line of light beneath the door and the small collapsed shape of the fire gone white in the hearth. For a while she lay still under her coat, watching her breath rise and disappear. The station was not silent. It never was. Wind moved along the roof tin. The wall gave one low creak as the sun touched stone. Somewhere near the back room, a mouse worried at dry paper and then stopped as if remembering the house had company now. The letter waited on the bench. She did not reach for it until she had made water hot and eaten the last of the beans from the coffee can. Hunger had a way of making everything theatrical if she let it. Better to eat first. Better to wash her hands in the warmed water, rubbing soot from the knuckles, drying them on the cleanest corner of the towel. Better to open old paper with ordinary care, not trembling ceremony. The folded letter had been tucked inside a leather pouch cut from the same russet hide as the tool roll. Its edges were dark with handling. The paper had browned, but the fold lines remained strong, as if it had been opened once, perhaps twice, then sealed away with the certainty that time would do the rest. When she lifted it, something in the handwriting stopped her. Not because she knew it, because she nearly did. The letters leaned slightly right, tall and narrow, with the capital T crossing farther than necessary, and the lower loops drawn tight, like thread pulled through leather. Abuelito's hand had carried some echo of it. Her mother's signature, when calm, had carried less. Rosalinda looked from the letter to the awl on the bench and back again, understanding before she could name it that craft did not travel only through tools. It traveled through pressure, spacing rhythm, and what a hand chose to repeat without knowing why. She unfolded the first crease, then the second. A dry smell rose from the paper, not unpleasant. Dust cedar leather and the faint mineral breath of the box that had kept it. She read, "My dear one, whoever you are, if this paper has reached your hands, then either I have been remembered longer than I expected, or forgotten long enough for remembering to become possible again. I do not know your name. I do not know whether you carry Ibarra blood, or whether you came to this house by purchase accident, mercy, or need. I know only that you have opened what I buried, and that your hands are now in conversation with mine. I write from Virginia City, Nevada, in the month of September 1898, under the care of Dr. Elias Whitcomb, who has told me what I already knew by the weight in my chest and the blood that comes when I cough. He calls it consumption, though the word sounds too gentle for something that takes a man a little at a time, and asks his family to watch. I have come here because there is work for a short while, repairing harness for men still pulling ore from stubborn ground. But the town is not what it was. The Comstock has thinned. The loud money has gone elsewhere. Streets that once shook with wagons now carry more dust than trade. I was born Tomas Ibarra in 1851 near Santa Fe, when the map had changed, but the habits of the people had not. My father was Esteban Ibarra, born 1822 near Abiquiu, a maker of pack saddles, bridles, and rawhide ropes. His father was Joaquin Ibarra, born 1794 near Taos, who learned leather from his mother, not his father, because his father died under a mule cart before he could pass on more than a knife and a debt. Her name was Maria Candelaria Robles, born 1771, and the family said she could judge a hide by laying it against her cheek in darkness. Before her, I have names without dates and stories without proof. It was a language he had been saving for someone who might still be able to hear it. He told stories while sharpening blades, not often at first and never in a hurry. He spoke of Nevada desert stations where horses came in lathered and left with the next rider before dust had settled behind the first. He spoke of blacksmiths who could judge iron by color in a coal fire of saddlers who slept under their own benches during hard winters. But I keep them because a name without paper may still be true in the mouth of a careful person. My mother was Ana Lucia Benavides, born 1828 near Las Vegas, New Mexico, where the wind teaches a child to close doors with both hands. She stitched finer than anyone I have known. She could sew a tear in a glove so clean the owner would later search for the damage and not find it. From her I learned that repair is not a lesser trade. Repair is a promise made after failure has already shown its face. I came west as a young man with a freight outfit following animals, iron and hunger. In 1868, I worked near the rail grade east of Reno, mending harness and traces for teams hauling supplies toward the Great Line. On May the 10th, 1869, when the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, men cheered as if distance itself had been defeated. I was not at the ceremony. I heard of it 2 days later from a teamster whose mule had thrown a shoe and whose eyes were still bright from telling the news. He said the country had been stitched together. I remember looking at the torn harness in my hands and thinking that stitches hold only when the strain has been understood. The railroad changed everything. Do not believe any man who says change arrives clean. It comes with blessing in one pocket and ruin in the other. The Pony Express had already ended before my time at Sand Springs, but the station still held the shape of speed. Men remembered the last relay ride of October 24th, 1861, and spoke of it the way older men speak of their own youth, with pride sharpened by loss. Stage routes shifted. Freight changed. Towns rose with false teeth and fell with real hunger. Saddles were still needed, then fewer, then different. Harness came in from factories. Men bought what was cheaper and cursed it when it failed, then bought cheaper again. I married Elena Maria Ortiz in 1873 at Dayton, Nevada. She was a laundress first, then a bookkeeper, then my better judgment in all matters except horses, about which she admitted no interest. We had 2 children. Our daughter, Magdalena, born 1875, lived 3 winters and is buried under a stone. I cut myself because I could not afford the one Elena wanted. Our son, Emilio Tomas, born 1879, carried more silence than laughter, but had a hand for drawing patterns. My younger brother, Raphael, rode with a volunteer unit and died of fever during the war with Spain this year, 1898. Not from a bullet, though the government will likely speak of service and leave the manner to God. I have placed his medal in the box because I cannot carry it east. and I will not sell it in a mining town. Elena died in 1891. After that, the house became work without supper, waiting behind it. For more than 30 years, I let silence collect around our family. Some of it was necessity. Some was pride. Some was the foolish belief that a man can spare others pain by refusing to speak of what shaped him. If this letter reaches someone young, let an old man tell you that silence is not the same as strength. It may keep a wound clean for a while, but it also keeps help from finding the door. I am leaving the tools because they were not mine alone. The awl with the bone handle belonged first to my father. The clamp was made by Joaquin from a broken chair leg and 2 scraps of oak. The half-moon knife I bought in Sacramento after 6 months of saving, and I have sharpened it so many times, the blade knows my wrist better than my own son does. The hides are good. I tanned them with oak bark liquor, turned twice, then finished with tallow neatsfoot oil and beeswax in a measure of 4 parts oil, 1 part melted tallow, and 1 part wax warmed only until the wax disappears. Do not boil it. If you smell scorching, you have already gone too far. If the leather has dried, lay it first in shade, not sun. Wipe with a damp cloth and wait until the surface darkens, then returns halfway. That is when it will take a mark without bruising. For tooling, the room should be cool if you can manage it near 60 degrees, though a poor maker works in whatever room hunger gives him. Keep the leather damp, but never wet enough to shine. Strike once with intention. 2 uncertain blows make 1 ugly flower. When stitching weight-bearing work, use waxed linen, if you can get it, 2 needles saddle stitch holes made with the awl at the same angle. Pull firm, not angry. If the thread sings, it is too tight. If it sleeps, it is too loose. Edges matter because they tell the hand what the eye may miss. Bevel both sides if the piece will be handled. Wet the edge lightly. Rub with canvas bone or hardwood until heat brings the fibers together. Of men who carried letters across empty land because someone somewhere was waiting to receive a line written by a familiar hand. There had been an Ibarra, he said, attached to a station east of the Sierra and west of nearly everything else. A blacksmith saddler. A man who could make a bridle last through alkali dust and winter frost. Abuelito did not know all of it. His own father had carried the story poorly, and his father before him had carried it with silence. A good edge feels settled. It does not scratch the palm. Do not waste the silver certificates. They are not buried here to make anyone rich. They are here to keep the tools from being sold in the first season of fear. Money is a bridge, not a house. Cross it carefully. Do not build your pride on it. If you are not of my family, then I ask only that you use what can be used and keep together what belongs together. If you are of my family, then I ask forgiveness for the distance between us. I do not know whether Emilio will return to this station after I go east. I do not know whether he will marry, or whether his children will learn the names I failed to say at the table. I do not know whether the Ibarra hand will continue in leather, or move into other labors. A name can survive without craft, but craft gives a name a room where memory may sit down. Inheritance is not ownership. It is attention. It is the willingness to receive what someone else could not finish and decide, with clean hands, whether it should be mended, used, passed on, or finally laid to rest. If you found this box because you were desperate, then do not be ashamed. Many worthy things begin under pressure. If you found it because you were curious, then let curiosity grow patient before it grows hungry. If you found it because you had nowhere else to go, then this house knows something about waiting. The small brass key was forged from a horseshoe nail by my brother Raphael before he left. I do not know whether the lock it opens will remain when you find it. Such things depend on weather and fools. The buckle is from an old mochila, given to me by a man who said he rode the final relay out of Sand Springs when the service ended. He may have lied. Men with failing teeth lie beautifully about their youth. Still, he cried when he gave it to me. And that is a kind of evidence. There is a mark behind the station where a horseshoe has grown into the walnut tree that Elena planted with dishwater and stubbornness. If the tree lives, greet it for me. If it has died, know that it tried. I have folded this paper with more care than I have lived some years. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Tomás Manuel Ibarra Sand Springs Station and Virginia City. September 18th, 1898. Rosalinda read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again. The second time, she did not try to hold all of it. She let the names pass into the room, one at a time. Esteban Joaquin, Maria, Candelaria, Ana Lucia, Elena, Magdalena, Emilio Rafael. They settled around the workbench without claiming more space than they needed. Her lips moved over the technical lines, the ratios, the warnings about heat and moisture, the difference between the thread that sings and thread that sleeps. When she finished, the fire had gone low. She folded the letter along its original creases, pressing each line with the side of her thumb. The paper seemed less fragile after being read, as if words had strengthened it by returning to air. She placed it back inside the leather pouch, but she did not put the pouch in the tin box. Not yet. She laid it beside the awl and the half-moon knife, where morning light could find them. Then she opened the door and stepped outside. The air was colder than she expected, bright with the kind of late-morning sun that makes every stone cast a clean shadow. Behind the station, the land sloped toward the wash and then lifted again into a scatter of greasewood sage and the few stubborn trees that had survived on whatever water the spring still offered. She had seen the walnut before from the road, but only as part of the background shape of the place. Now she walked toward it as one might walk toward a person named in a letter. The tree was not large by river standards, but in that desert it seemed nearly generous. Its trunk leaned east, bark furrowed deep branches bare, except for a few dark leaves caught high, where the wind had failed to take them. Around its base lay shells split open by birds or time. On the north side, half hidden by bark that had swollen around it, was the curve of an iron horseshoe. Rosalinda stopped. The shoe had not been nailed to the tree. It had been placed against it when the trunk was younger, perhaps wired there, perhaps wedged in a fork that had since closed over iron with the slow insistence of living wood. Now only the outer curve and 2 nail holes showed. The rest had been received. She touched the bark beside it. It was cold, ridged, and alive. There was no sign, no marker, no carved initials. Only the horseshoe, the tree, the letter's instruction. But the name had crossed the desert once, and the desert had kept part of it. Rosalinda loved those stories because they did not ask anything from her. They did not require her to choose sides in a kitchen, to measure her worth by another person's mood, or to explain why she felt more herself in a shed full of hand tools than in any classroom. They simply opened like a gate left unlatched. The unforgettable thing he told her came the summer she turned 19, and the quiet proof that Elena had planted something here with dishwater and stubbornness. Rosalinda stood under the bare branches until wind moved through them and clicked the dry stems together. It sounded almost like tools being sorted on a bench. "I greet you," she said. The words came out rough and low. They disappeared into the open air. When she returned inside, she brought with her 3 fallen walnuts, each blackened husk dried hard around the shell. She set them on the mantelstone above the hearth. Then she searched the back room for the candle she had noticed the first week inside the cracked stoneware jar, half buried in hardened grease. It was not much of a candle now, just a yellowed stub in a tin holder, the wick bent and black at the tip. The jar had kept it from mice and dust, though the wax had bloomed white with age. She cleaned the holder with the corner of a rag. The wick resisted the match twice before catching. On the 3rd try, flame rose small and blue, then steadied into gold. The candle gave off a faint smell of old tallow, not sweet, not clean, but human. Someone had made it to push back darkness in a room where work outlasted daylight. Someone had pinched that wick and left enough for another evening. 60 years, perhaps more, had passed over the stub without using it up. Rosalinda placed it on the bench beside the tools. The flame leaned when the wind found the wall seams. It straightened when the room settled. Its light was too small to change the station, but it changed the objects nearest it. The awl handle glowed the color of old ivory. The half-moon knife took a thin line of fire along its curve. The medal's worn date appeared again. She sat on the floor with her back against the workbench and let the small light do what it could. There had been kindnesses. She saw them now not as rescue, because rescue was too large and too simple, but as links in a chain laid down by people who may not have known they were laying it. The waitress in Reno refilling coffee she had not paid for twice. The woman from the storage unit pressing $2 folded into her palm after noticing how gently she handled cracked leather. The librarian in Fallon giving her scrap paper and a misaddressed stamped envelope. Mrs. Hardwick placing her own dollar into the deed envelope. Everett Morris writing credit instead of charity and adding a wire brush to the sack. None of them had changed her life alone. That was not how mercy usually worked. It arrived in modest portions, just enough to get a person to the next door, the next morning, the next place where a decision could still be made. A cup of coffee, a sheet of paper, a tool on credit, a dollar folded where pride could survive it. Small kindness had a way of outliving the hand that gave it. And now, if you are listening from a lit room, maybe with dishes still in the sink or a blanket across your knees, I want to ask you something plain. Think of a kindness that once seemed too small to matter. A ride given without lecture. A meal left on a porch. A bill delayed. A teacher who stayed after class. A neighbor who noticed the light had been off too long. Tell us in the comments, if you are willing, what small kindness helped you keep going. Not because every private thing belongs in public, but because someone else may be listening tonight from the hard edge of their own life, needing proof that a gentle act can travel farther than the giver ever sees. The candle burned lower. Rosalinda rose before it failed and prepared the room for night. She banked the fire with 2 careful pieces of wood. She wrapped the hides again in burlap, but this time she placed them on the bench instead of near the opened floor. She slid the silver, certificates, coins, medal buckle, and brass key back into the tin box, then set the box under the bench where she could reach it by hand. The letter, pouch, she kept apart. The tools she laid beside her bedroll. Not for protection, for company. The awl nearest her hand. The stitching clamp beside it. The edger wrapped in cloth. The half-moon knife still covered its curved weight, resting against the folded leather strip Abuelito had left unfinished on his bench without meaning to leave anything at all. She placed the letter pouch beneath the photograph of him, and for a moment the old man in the picture seemed to be looking not at her, but at the work waiting past her shoulder. Outside, the walnut branches moved against the stars. Inside, the station held the fire's last warmth in its stones. Rosalinda lay down on the floor closer to the workbench than to the hearth and pulled her coat across her chest. The house did not feel repaired. It did not feel safe. It did not even feel fully hers. When she brought him a belt she had made alone, the tooling was clean, the edges burnished, the buckle set square. She expected praise, or at least one of his slow nods. Instead, he turned it over and placed one finger on the underside where she had hidden a place the edger had skipped. "What you hide still holds weight," he said. That was all. At the time, she flushed hot with embarrassment and looked down at the concrete floor. Later, she understood he had given her more than a correction, but it no longer felt empty. Before sleep took her, she opened one hand and rested it lightly on the bone handle of the awl. The tool had crossed more silence than she could yet understand. It had waited under boards, under earth, under years of dust and winter and forgetting. Now it lay beside a woman with cracked hands, a county deed, and no clear map beyond morning. That was enough for one night. The first snow came on December the 3rd, just before dawn, and measured 4 inches by the coffee can. She sat outside the door. It did not fall gently. It arrived on a north wind that drove flakes beneath the roof tin, through the gaps around the boarded windows, and under the front door, where the wire latch still held the plank against its frame. Rosalinda woke to snow lying in a thin white drift along the east wall, delicate as flour, but cold enough to burn her fingertips when she swept it into a pan. The fire had died before morning. Her water had frozen solid. The station seemed to have withdrawn into itself, not hostile, not welcoming, simply exact about what winter meant. She read the roofing chapter 3 times that day. The first reading gave her words: underlayment, flashing, exposure, drip edge, starter course, ridge cap. The second reading gave her sequence: strip what fails, protect what remains, start low, overlap everything in the direction water wants to travel. The third reading gave her warnings, and warnings mattered most. Do not roof over rot. Do not trust a nail that misses wood. Do not let pride keep you above ground when wind says otherwise. She measured the building with cord because she owned no proper tape long enough for the roofline. 40 feet by 18 on the main rectangle, with enough pitch to shed snow if the tin lay flat and the cedar shakes beneath had not been eaten by weather. The collapsed lean-to was beyond saving for that winter, so she calculated only what could keep the front and back rooms dry. 2 roof planes, roughly 800 square feet, allowing for slope waste and mistakes. She wrote the numbers in the manual margin with Everett's pencil. At Morris Hardware, Everett checked her figures without speaking. Roll roofing would be cheaper, he said at last. Would it hold for a season? Maybe 2 if weather felt charitable. And shingles, more money, more work, more honest. She looked at the list on the counter. He wrote beneath it 20 bundles, cedar shakes, salvaged from a ranch job, mixed grade, but sound $12 total if she took the imperfect ones. 2 rolls, 15-pound felt, $4.60. 5 pounds galvanized roofing nails, $1.35. 1 tin roof cement, 82 cents. 2 lengths drip edge bent from scrap. No charge if she helped carry them from the shed. I cannot pay all of it now. I know. I need to know how much the account can hold before it breaks. Everett removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose where the red mark deepened by afternoon. Accounts do not break, he said. People do when folks stop telling them the number. He turned the ledger toward her. Her name had 3 lines beneath it, each item written carefully, each price exact. He added the roofing materials, then tapped the total with his pencil. It was larger than she wanted, and smaller than disaster. From under the counter, he brought out a roofing hatchet with a square pole, a notched blade, and a handle worn darker near the end. My brother used this before his knees went, he said. He is dead now, so it is done waiting in a drawer. I can return it. You can bring it back when the roof stops leaking. The next morning, a man named Walter Pike came to the station. Everett had not warned her, except to say, a fellow may stop by. Let him look before you climb. Walter arrived in a blue pickup, the color of old denim, with a ladder tied in the bed and a thermos wedged on the seat. He was 70, perhaps older, short and thick through the shoulders, with eyebrows like wire and hands that made even the roofing hatchet look modest. He had been a roofer until a fall in 1969 left one leg slightly shorter in its movement than the other. He told her this only after he had walked the perimeter of the station twice and spat once into the snow. Roof's tired, he said. Yes, sir. So are you. Rosalinda held her answer. He looked up at the lifted tin, the missing shakes, the dark mouth of the chimney gap, and the sag over the east room. You pay me, I leave. I have almost nothing. That is why I said it. His teaching style had no cushion. He pointed with 2 fingers. Sister Rafter, there, not full length. The county had condemned it since 1976 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the wide plank floorboards near the old mochila rack in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 80 years was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hidden work still carried strain. Hidden fear shaped a room. Hidden tenderness could outlast the people who failed to speak it. A life like leather kept the impression of every pressure placed upon it. When Abuelito died, the shed was locked from the inside. It was April, with almond blossoms falling across the sidewalk like torn paper. Rosalinda arrived after the ambulance had already gone and found his hat on the kitchen table crowned down as if he had meant to return for it, but enough to carry load to sound wood. Chalk line before felt. Starter row hangs past drip edge, not shy of it. Nail high and covered. 3 strokes only. First sets. Second drives. Third seats. If you need 4, your arm is lying. That nail's proud. She looked where he pointed. Pull it. She pulled it. Too deep. She pried out the next. Again. For 11 days, the roof became the measure of daylight. They worked when the frost had softened enough to keep their boots from skating across tin, and stopped when the afternoon wind came over the rise with a force that turned balance into argument. Walter would not let her climb when Gus lifted the felt. He did not praise caution. He simply descended first, then took the ladder away from the wall. Ground, he said. I can finish that row. Ground. She came down. They stripped loose tin, stacked usable sheets by the collapsed lean-to, and removed cedar shakes that crumbled under the hatchet's edge. Where the east rafter had cracked near the bird opening, Walter cut a sister from salvaged 2x6, set it alongside the damaged member, and had her drive nails in staggered pairs. Do not nail a ladder, he said. She paused. He tapped the board. Stagger. Wood splits when fools march straight. The chalk line was an education in humility. Walter snapped it once and made a blue line appear across the felt straight as judgment. Rosalinda tried the next row and left a wandering mark that widened near the chimney. Walter handed the chalk box back. String has no opinion. Hold it right. By the 4th day, she could set a shake by feel leaving the proper exposure and checking its neighbor without measuring every time. By the 6th, her thumb had opened under the nail heads, and Walter wrapped it in black electrical tape without comment. By the 8th, snowmelt ran down the new courses and fell clean beyond the wall, instead of slipping through the ceiling into a coffee can. They ate lunch sitting on overturned buckets in the lee of the north wall. Walter drank coffee from his thermos. Rosalinda ate beans and bread. Conversation came in fragments, never pulled from either of them by force. Everett says your people had leather hands. My grandfather did. You some grows. On the 11th day, under a sky the color of pewter, they set the ridge caps. Walter showed her how to overlap them away from the prevailing wind, how to seat nails where the next piece would cover them, how to leave enough obedience in the line that water would move without being invited inside. At the chimney, they patched with roof cement and tin flashing that would not satisfy a proper mason, but would keep snow from pouring through before spring. When the final nail was driven, Walter climbed down first and stood in the yard looking up. Rosalinda came beside him. Her arms ached so badly that resting them at her sides felt like work. Will it hold? She asked. Walter tipped his head. Long enough to teach you the next thing. By mid-December, the station no longer woke with snow on the floor. That did not make it warm. It did not make it whole. But the first great breach above her had been answered by felt cedar iron and 11 days of deliberate hands. January found the chimney's deeper failures. The first cleaning had made it usable with caution, but winter fire revealed what daylight inspection had not. Bricks near the upper throat were spalling their faces, flaking into red powder whenever heat rose through the flue. Mortar at the firebox corners could be scraped loose with a fingernail. On cold mornings, fine grit gathered on the hearthstones like cinnamon, and Rosalinda began to understand Everett's warning that chimney trouble could kill a person without raising its voice. She carried 3 samples of crumbled mortar to Morris Hardware wrapped in newspaper. Everett opened the packet, pressed the grains between thumb and forefinger, and shook his head. Too much Portland will bully that brick apart. I was going to buy regular mortar mix. Do not. He took her to the back shelf where older materials sat below newer certainty. Hydraulic lime in a torn paper sack, fireclay in a lidded pail, washed sand in a bin. He wrote the mix on the back of a receipt. 2 parts, sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/2 part fireclay for areas near heat. Water added slowly. Rest 10 minutes. Knock it up again. Use before it stiffens. Keep from freezing until set. Can I do this from below some? Not all. I am not climbing the roof in January. Then do what you can reach and do it well. Bad pride drops people. Good patience leaves a repair for April. For 3 weeks, the grapevines were only beginning to leaf. A pan of beans sat cold on the stove. In the shed, a strip of russet leather was clamped to the bench marked for stitching, but not yet pierced. He had been 87. The family came in a loose, practical procession. Cousins from Fresno. An aunt from Sacramento. Men who had not entered the shed in years but suddenly knew the value of every tool by weight and age. Rosalinda stood by the door while boxes filled. The half-moon knives went first. She worked in temperatures that held in the 20s before noon and dropped again before the mortar wanted to cure. She built small fires in the morning, then let the brick cool until it was warm but not hot to the touch. She cleaned joints with the cold chisel, not digging deeper than sound material allowed, then brushed dust loose with the wire brush. She misted the old brick lightly because dry brick would steal water from new mortar and leave the joint weak before it had even begun. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves were too clumsy for the tight work, so she used them only when mixing. For pointing the joints, she worked with fingers, wrapped in cloth, pressing mortar into voids, packing it firm, cutting the surface back with the edge of the trowel. When feeling left her fingertips, she stopped. She held both hands near the little stove of coals until pain returned in bright needles. Then began again. The station took on the smell of lime-damp brick and wood smoke. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of a wound being cleaned. At night, she covered the repaired firebox with a burlap sack warmed by the hearth and kept the room just above freezing with small, careful fires that did not shock the new work. The manual had very little to say about doing masonry while living beside the masonry, but the building itself instructed her. Too much heat too soon, and the repair hairline cracked. Too much water, and the mortar sagged. Too little patience, and the joint showed it by morning. She learned to mix smaller batches. 1/2 coffee can of sand. 1/4 can lime. A measured handful of fireclay. Water from the spring warmed near the fire, so it would not numb the mix before it began. She stirred with a broken axe handle until the mortar held ridges. Then she waited 10 minutes as Everett had written, watching it slacken, thicken, become itself. The chimney had been built by hands that knew economy. No brick wasted, no joint wider than need required. The firebox was set low with stones at the base, and brick above, meant for heat, not display. As Rosalinda repaired it, she began to recognize decisions in the masonry. A brick turned lengthwise to carry stress. A flattened stone shimmed under one corner. A seam widened where the builder had corrected level without tearing out the course. She did not improve those decisions. She joined them. Late in the third week, Everett came out in the afternoon with a box of groceries he pretended had been ordered wrong by a customer. Flour, onions, coffee beans, and a tin of peaches dented on one side. He inspected the chimney without touching it, then crouched and looked along the new joints. "Too neat in that corner," he said. Rosalinda glanced at the place. "Is that bad?" "Only if you wanted it to match the rest of this tired sinner." His beard moved slightly. It was nearly a smile. On January the 28th, after 4 days of curing and 2 nights kept carefully above freezing, she made the test, fire. Not a warming fire. A test. Paper kindling 3 narrow pieces of wood, all laid with enough air between them to let flame rise without smothering. She opened the damper, checked the hearth, checked the roofline outside for wind, then struck the match. Smoke lifted. The fire drew clean, not in a sudden, hungry pull, but steady and sure. No smoke rolled into the room. No grit fell from the upper throat. Outside, she stood in the yard with her coat wrapped tight and watched a pale column rise from the chimney into the cold Nevada air. It did not twist back under the roof. It did not seep from the joints. It went up. Rosalinda stayed there until her ears hurt from cold watching the smoke become part of the sky. The floors waited until the roof no longer leaked and the chimney no longer threatened. They had been underfoot the whole time, complaining in their own language. White pine planks, wide and uneven, some nearly 14 inches across, laid with hand-cut rosehead nails darkened by age. Near the door, grit had worked into the grain until the wood felt like stone. Around the hearth, scorch marks spread in overlapping half-moons. By the mochila rack, the board she had lifted for the cash sat flush again, but now she knew the weight of what had been hidden beneath it. She did not want to sand away history. She wanted to remove neglect without erasing use. Everett rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, half the usual deposit, with a warning written in his voice before he said it aloud. "Keep it moving. I will." "No, you will think you are moving it. Then you will admire your own thought and burn a circle into pine." "I will keep it moving." He sent her with sanding discs in 3 grits, 8100, 2220. Start rough enough to clean. Then the awls, the overstitch wheels, the copper rivets, the heavy splitter bolted to the bench. Someone found a buyer in Turlock before the funeral flowers had browned. She asked for 1 tool roll. Just 1. Her mother looked toward the others, then toward the floor. "This is not the time," she said. By evening, the shed sounded hollow. The bench remained scarred and bare with pale rectangles, where things had rested for half a century. Not so rough it chews. Vacuum if you have one, which she did not. Sweep twice between passes. Wipe with barely damp cloth. Let dry. Feel with the palm, not the eye. She began at the back wall and worked toward the door. The first pass with 80 grit was loud enough to change the station's nature. For weeks, the building had been filled with hand sounds, scraping, brushing, tapping, cutting the small movements of repair. The sander brought a machine's insistence, a circular growl that pressed against her teeth. Dust rose at once, pale and fragrant, carrying the smell of pine that had been sealed under grime for decades. She wore the dust mask until sweat made it cling. Every few minutes, she stopped to sweep. The old surface came away reluctantly. Dirt, grayness, stains from water and animals. The grain appeared beneath first in patches, then in long, interrupted ribbons. Around the hearth, she sanded by hand, unwilling to let the machine blunt the edge of old burn marks. Those marks belonged. So did the nail heads, each rose shape catching dust around its rim. The second pass, 120 grit, changed the wood from cleaned to revealed. Her shoulders had begun to ache by then. The sander pulled forward when she tired, leaving her to guide rather than command it. She learned to bend from the knees, to overlap each path, to pause at the end of a row and let the machine stop spinning before lifting it from the floor. Everett's warning stayed with her. Keep it moving. By the third pass, 220 grit, the station had filled with a fine powder that softened every surface. Her hair was grey with it. Her eyelashes held it. The workbench tools, mantel stones, and even the tin box beneath the bench had to be covered with cloth. When she wiped a clean plank with the side of her palm, the wood felt less like floor than skin. She returned the sander before closing. Everett plugged it in behind the counter, listened to the motor, then nodded. You did not kill it. No. Or yourself. Not yet. He handed back part of the deposit, though she knew the ledger would tell a more complicated truth. The finish took longer than the sanding. She had debated shellac paint wax and nothing at all. Everett recommended 3 coats of a mixture, close to what the station's age would tolerate. Tung oil cut lightly for the first coat, followed by boiled linseed oil rubbed thin, then another coat of tung after cure. Not poured, not flooded. Cloth only. Wipe on weight. Wipe off what does not drink. 48 hours cure between coats longer if cold holds the room. The first coat darkened the pine so suddenly she drew back. The floor, which had looked pale after sanding, turned dark honey within minutes. Grain rose in bands and knots. Old scars deepened. The boards near the hearth took the oil unevenly, keeping a memory of heat. By morning, the colour had settled into something richer. Not new, not polished, but awake. The second coat brought amber into the worn places. The third, after another 48 hours, carried the floor toward mahogany, where age smoke oil and winter light met. Rosalinda worked on her knees with cloth wrapped around her hand, rubbing each board with the grain. She kept the coats thin. She buffed until her arms trembled. She left the old nail heads dark, the scorch marks visible, the lifted cash plank indistinguishable unless a person knew exactly where to look. One morning between coats, she did not work. It was not planned. She rose before dawn, made coffee, warmed beans, and stood looking at the unfinished section near the back room. Her hands were swollen at the knuckles. Her thumb had split again. Her shoulders held a deep ache that sleep no longer reached. The station seemed full of tasks leaning toward her from every wall. She put on her coat and walked to the marsh. The La Hontan wetlands lay low and silver in the distance, where water gathered in patient sheets among reeds and winter grass. She had seen birds there before, dark specks lifting at her approach, but that morning the place seemed almost empty. She sat on a cold stone near the water's edge, wrapped both hands around the coffee can, and watched a great blue heron stand in the shallows. The bird did not hurry. It lifted one leg, placed. It waited, then lifted the other. Its reflection trembled beneath it. Wind moved the reeds. The heron's body remained still except for the exact machinery of hunger and balance. Rosalinda watched until the cold entered through her boots and the coffee had gone bitter. She did not pray. She did not decide anything. Rosalinda took the strip of unfinished leather from the clamp and folded it into her coat. It was the only thing no one had priced. After Abuelito, the family did not break all at once. It thinned. Weekend calls became holiday messages. Holiday messages became cards with signatures, but no sentences. Her mother remarried a man named Dale Whitcomb, who worked in insurance, wore square glasses, and believed every room could be improved by removing what he called clutter. Dale was not loud. She only sat there, while one living thing moved slowly enough to make slowness seem permitted. That day, the floor waited. By evening, she returned, ate bread and peaches from the dented tin, and slept without guilt. The next morning, she finished the final coat. February brought light back through glass. The station had 8 windows if the back room openings were counted, though. For months, most of them had been boards, cracks, and weather. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes that rattled when wind crossed the wash. One narrow and bubbled still carried its original imperfect glass, wavy enough to bend the desert into a watery shape when seen from inside. Everett said it was not from 1788, no matter what the old county notation claimed, because the building itself did not belong to that century. The record likely meant 1887, or someone's clerkly mistake carried forward until error acquired authority. Still, the pane was old hand-wavy and intact. He told her not to replace it unless it broke under its own will. Some mistakes become history, he said. Leave that one alone. She did. For the missing panes, he found salvage glass from a schoolhouse remodel outside Fernley. The pieces had scratches, bubbles, and one corner already clipped, but they would keep wind out if cut carefully. He showed her how to measure from rabbit to rabbit, subtract 1/8 inch for movement, and never trust the first number, written in cold fingers. The glass cutter came from a drawer near the register, its little wheel oiled with a drop from a can older than the telephone. Score once, Everett said. Only once. Glass remembers hesitation badly. She practiced on scrap until she could hear the right sound, not a scrape, not a crack, but a steady, dry hiss under pressure. Then she cut the 3 missing panes, each one a small lesson in breath control. The cracked panes came out in pieces. She worked from inside on calm mornings, setting a blanket beneath the sash to catch shards. Old glazing putty had hardened into a substance more like stone than paste. She softened it where she could with cautious heat from a tin reflector near the fire, then chipped it loose with the putty knife. Glazier points came free, black and bent. Dust gathered along the sill. Once a triangular piece slipped and cut the side of her finger, not deeply, but enough to leave a line of blood across the white pine floor before she noticed. She wiped it at once. Then she sat back and laughed once under her breath because the floor had already known worse than blood. The putty was DAP-33, bought in a small can with instructions printed too neatly for the work it required. Everett had shown her how to roll it between both palms into a cord press, it into the rabbit, set the pane gently against it, then place the glazier points with the flat of the putty knife. Not hammered. Pressed. Glass, he said, punished impatience in the hand that held it. The final bevel was the trick. Her first line looked like a hill road after rain wandering thick and thin across the sash. She scraped it off and began again. The putty had to be warm enough to move cool enough to hold pressed at a steady angle so water would shed away from the glass. She learned to draw the knife toward herself in one careful motion, wiping the excess on a scrap of cardboard, cleaning the edge with a cloth dampened in mineral spirits used sparingly because every drop cost money. The sash cords were next. 3 windows had broken ropes, the old cotton cords snapped and lost inside the weight pockets. She opened the narrow access panels with the utility knife and found the counterweights resting in dust below iron cylinders tied to nothing. Everett sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord by the foot and drew the knot on brown paper figure 8 at the counterweight, clean and tight tail, trimmed but not proud. Feed over pulley. Tie to sash. Test before closing the pocket. The first one took an hour and left her with dust in her sleeve up to the elbow. The second took 40 minutes. By the third, she understood the hidden balance. The sash was not meant to be lifted by force alone. The counterweight carried part of the burden inside the wall unseen but exact. When properly tied, the window rose with one hand and stayed where she left it, neither falling shut nor gaping open. She stood there, moving it up and down several times, feeling the old mechanism return to its intended courtesy. February light changed the station one pane at a time. In the front room, the new glass turned dawn from a draft into a presence. In the back room, it showed the bench scarred and waiting. He did not slam doors. He did not need to. His authority came through rearrangement. He moved the kitchen clock 3 inches higher because he said it looked more balanced. He replaced her mother's striped curtains with beige blinds. He labeled pantry shelves in block letters. Flour, sugar, rice, miscellaneous. Rosalinda was 24, then old enough to rent her own room, but too poor to keep it for long. She came back after a warehouse layoff, carrying 2 boxes, a sewing machine, the peg rail empty, but no longer abandoned. Through the wavy original pane, the walnut tree bent and shimmered as if seen through water, the horseshoe hidden on its far side, the branches holding winter with a patience that seemed less like endurance than instruction. The last window was the south-facing one near the mochila rack. Its lower sash had no glass, and the upper pane was cracked from corner to corner, but still holding. Rosalinda removed the broken pieces, cleaned the rabbit, set new points in a line, and rolled the putty between her hands until it softened. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch, close enough to be seen clearly through the opening. It had a black cap, pale cheeks, and a body so compact against the cold that it seemed made of breath and will. The bird turned its head. Rosalinda held still with the putty knife in her hand. For several seconds, the station, the woman, the winter tree, and the small bird shared one frame without needing anything from one another. Then the chickadee flicked away into the branches, and the window was only a window again, unfinished and waiting for the final bevel. She drew the putty knife down the sash in one long, careful pass. This time, the line held. By late February, the walls began asking for attention in a softer voice. The roof had stopped the snow. The chimney drew clean. The floor held warmth in a way it had not before. And the windows no longer let the desert wind pass through, as if the station were only a suggestion. Once the worst breaches were answered, the smaller wounds became visible. Near the chimney breast, 3 patches of plaster had failed, where old leaks, heat, and freezing nights had done their patient damage. The surface bulged in one place, cracked in another, and fell away entirely near the back room opening, exposing hand-split oak lath beneath. Rosalinda stood before the largest patch with her hands in her coat pockets. The plaster was not modern gypsum. It was horsehair plaster laid in older coats over thin oak strips split by hand, each strip nailed with little irregular heads that caught light when dust was brushed away. In the broken places, she could see the work clearly. Scratch coat pressed through the lath and mushroomed behind it. Brown coat leveled over that. Finish coat thin and pale polished by time smoke and the shoulders of people moving past. She did not want to cover it with something easier. At Morris Hardware, Everett listened without interrupting as she described the failure. Then he disappeared into the storage room and came back carrying a paper sack with faded blue printing and mouse-nibbled corners. "My father bought this in the 50s, he said. Horsehair. Real. Not much call for it now." He set it on the counter beside a small bag of lime and a tin of fine sand. Still good. Hair lasts longer than most opinions. He wrote the plaster sequence in the ledger. Margin scratch coat with lime mortar and chopped hair scored while damp. Brown coat 3/8 inch kept flat, 72 hours before finish if weather stays cold. Finish coat 1/8 inch tight and smooth, no fussing after it begins to set. "Do not make it pretty all at once," he said. "That is how beginners make cracks." Back at the station, she cut away only what had failed. Sound plaster stayed. She tapped with the wooden handle of the putty knife, listening for hollow places, and marked them with chalk. Then she cleared loose edges back to firm material, brushed the exposed lath, and misted it until the old wood darkened but did not drip. The scratch coat felt almost primitive in the hand. Lime sand, water, and horsehair worked together until the mix held like thick porridge with fibers running through it. She pressed it between the lath, forcing it through enough to key behind, then scored the surface with diagonal lines using a scrap of broken comb she found in the debris pile. The wall looked wounded afterward but orderly. The brown coat came 3 days later. 3/8 of an inch was more difficult than the number suggested. Too thin and it would not meet the surrounding wall. Too thick and it sagged away from the lath. She used a straight board as a screed, drawing it upward, shaving high places, filling low ones, learning the discipline of not touching what had already begun to answer. Her arms remembered the roof, the sander, the chimney. The wall required a different patience, less force, and more listening. By the time the finish coat went on, the station had taken on the damp mineral smell of lime curing in cold air. She spread the final 1/8 inch with the smallest trowel, smoothing it tight against the edges of original plaster. It did not disappear. An abuelito's folded strip of leather wrapped in newspaper. Dale gave her the den for 3 months, then 6, then an undefined period that made every breakfast feel provisional. He had a way of speaking that turned generosity into a ledger. Electricity is not sentimental, he said when she worked late at the kitchen table. Storage has a cost, he said when he saw her boxes stacked beside the laundry door. Adults need forward direction. A person who looked closely would see the repair, the slight difference in texture, the modest change in color. That was acceptable. A hidden repair could become a lie if it pretended no damage had ever happened. When the last patch had set firm under her hand, Rosalinda stood back in the evening light and touched the wall beside the chimney. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it without drama, almost as a note to the room. The station did not answer except by holding. Doris, from the Sagebrush Cafe, began leaving paper bags on the doorstep in March. At first, Rosalinda thought they had been misplaced by someone taking pity in secret, which would have made it easier to ignore them. The first bag held 3 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a jar of stew with fat-sealed pail across the top, and 2 heel slices of pie, too broken to sell. The second held coffee grounds soup bones and a folded napkin with the words "No need to return the jar" written in block letters. On the third morning, Rosalinda walked into the cafe with all 3 jars washed and wrapped in cloth. Doris stood behind the counter, wiping down a row of stools. She was a broad woman with red hair going white at the temples and forearms strong from lifting coffee pots, plates, and years of other people's impatience. The cafe smelled of onions, bacon, grease, dish soap, and warm sugar. A radio played low near the kitchen, though no one appeared to be listening. "I believe these are yours," Rosalinda said. Doris looked at the jars, then at Rosalinda's face. "I believe they are clean. I cannot pay for food I did not order. You did not order it. That is what I mean." Doris folded the towel and placed it under the counter. "My cook makes too much when weather changes. Always has. Better on your step than in the trash. I can work. Kitchen's full. I can mend something." Doris rested one hand on the counter, considering. Then she pulled a cracked leather menu cover from beneath the register. The corner had split and the stitching had failed along the spine. When the shop reopens, Doris said, "You can pay me in candles." Rosalinda looked at the menu cover. "Candles? Place that old needs candles. People like a light in a window. Bring me 2 when you are selling what you sell." "I am not selling anything. Not today." After that, the bags continued without apology. Sometimes cornbread. Sometimes soup. Once, a paper-wrapped roast bone with enough meat left to season beans for 3 days. Doris never mentioned them when Rosalinda came into town. She only nodded, poured coffee for truck drivers, and kept her own accounts in a currency that did not show in Everett's ledger. Caleb appeared with a splitting maul over one shoulder and a Schwinn bicycle lying in the ditch behind him. He was 14, perhaps 15, all wrists and elbows, with hair cut unevenly above his ears and a jacket too thin for the wind. Rosalinda found him standing near the woodpile, examining her hatchet work with the serious disapproval of someone who had just discovered adults could be inefficient. "You miss Ibarra." "No. You miss Ibarra, Rosalinda. My mother said you need wood split. Who is your mother, Doris?" That answered more than one question. Caleb dragged the bicycle upright, leaned it against the walnut tree, and lifted the maul, as if he had been born with it in hand. He was not graceful, but he was exact. He placed each round upright adjusted it until the check in the wood faced the blade, then brought the maul down with a force that seemed to pass through his thin frame from somewhere older than muscle. The first round split clean. "I can do that," Rosalinda said. He looked at the uneven pile near the wall. "I saw." She let the silence settle. "How much do you charge?" "My mother said not to take money. I need people to stop saying that. My mother said you would say that." He split another round. She also said he added, breathing harder now, "About your grandfather." Rosalinda had not known Doris knew the story. What did she say? That her daddy took a bridle to him once. Said he fixed it better than new, and would not let him pay full, because the horse was lame. Caleb set another round, missed the center, and corrected the split with the back of the maul. My mother remembers people like that. He worked for 2 hours. When he stopped, the woodpile had changed from a heap of unsolved labor into neat rows stacked under the patched lean-to tin. Rosalinda offered him bread and stew. He accepted both without making it charity, by refusing, or performance by thanking too much. Before he left, he tightened the chain on his Schwinn with a wrench from his pocket. "I can come Saturdays," he said. He said when she took a job binding catalogues at a print shop. Her mother listened from sinks and thresholds. She had become more careful with age, not softer. Her face held its beauty in a guarded way, like a lamp seen behind drawn curtains. When Dale spoke, she busied her hands. When Rosalinda answered, her mother watched the nearest object instead of her daughter's mouth. There were years like that. Years of rooms borrowed rather than lived in. Years of envelopes marked final notice. "I still cannot pay." He swung one leg over the bicycle. My mother said. Then he rode off down the rutted road, the maul balanced across the handlebars, his back narrow against the open land. Reverend Boyd did not offer goods credit or labor. He walked past every morning. The first time Rosalinda saw him, she mistook him for a rancher because of the coat. It was dark wool, patched at one elbow, and his hat was not a Sunday hat, but a weather hat, broad at the brim and shaped by use. He was pastor of the little church near the edge of Fallon, though he lived farther out with a widowed sister, and walked the road for his health, as he told her on the third morning. He had a brown face deeply lined by sun and eyes that seemed to rest rather than inspect. Each morning he came along the road near 7, sometimes carrying a walking stick, sometimes not. At the station he slowed, tipped his hat and kept moving. The first week that was all. The second week he said morning. She answered. The third week, when the wind had blown ash from the hearth across the new floor, and Rosalinda was sweeping with more force than necessary, he paused at the open door. "Hard house," he said. "Honest one." He nodded, accepting the correction or the agreement. It was difficult to tell. From then on, his passing became part of the station's morning. Coffee beginning to steam. Fire coaxed from coal. Light catching the new window putty. Reverend Boyd's boots on the road steady, unhurried. He never asked to come inside. He never asked whether she had found faith in the building, as if faith were a lost object under a plank. He simply lifted his hat each time, and once, when late snow fell wet across the yard, he stopped near the walnut tree and bowed his head. "Lord, keep this house." 4 words. Then he walked on. Rosalinda stood in the doorway with her broom in hand and watched his figure move away along the road. His prayer remained in the cold air for several moments after he had gone plain as smoke, then thinned into morning. She postponed the cellar until February 11th. There had always been a door to it, low and half hidden, behind the broken barrel in the back room. The first week she had opened it only enough to smell cold stone, damp earth, and the faint breath of something deeper than the station's daily needs. Then she had closed it again. A cellar could wait. Roofs, chimneys, floors, windows, and heat could not. By the time she returned to it, the latch had stiffened in winter. She worked oil into the hinge, lifted the barrel aside, and tied a rope from the workbench to her waist, because a person alone should not descend into unknown dark while pretending gravity made exceptions. The steps were granite, 7 of them worn slightly at the center, descending beneath the back room into a space roughly 12 by 15 feet. Her lantern showed fieldstone walls laid without vanity, each stone fitted by a weight angle and necessity. The floor was also fieldstone, except at the center, where a single dressed granite slab sat flush with the surrounding stones. It measured nearly 3 feet by 4 pale grey, smooth at the top, with a carved mark near one corner. A crescent blade above a needle, the same mark from the scrap of paper in the leather pouch. Rosalinda stood on the last step and let the lantern light move over it. The slab was not a loose stone. She could tell by the way its edges met the floor, by the settled dust in the seams, by the absence of pry marks. It had been placed to remain. For a long moment, curiosity pressed at her hands. The old story hunger rose, the one that wants every hidden thing opened simply because it has been found. She did not lift it. There were reasons beyond fear. The cellar was cold, the lantern weak, and the slab too heavy for one person working alone. But the truer reason was that the station had already given enough for one season. Some doors stayed closed, not because they had taken enough, as her mother had once said, but because opening them required a steadier life than desperation could provide. She swept around it instead. Along the north wall were empty shelves, their boards bowed but intact. One held 3 glass jars without lids. Another held a rusted hinge, a coil of wire, and a clay pipe stem. In the west corner, she found a crock filled with sand, perhaps once used for storing root vegetables. The air was colder below, but not wet enough to threaten what might be stored there after proper cleaning. On the way back up, her lantern threw light beneath the 3rd step. Something small sat wedged between stone and riser. She crouched, braced one shoulder against the wall, and worked it free with the awl from her cheap kit. It was an oak box, no longer than her hands, swollen slightly, but sound. Years of temporary work, of thrift store shoes, of bus transfers in rain. Rosalinda made small repairs for people when she could, a purse strap for Mrs. Alvarez's niece, a cracked dog collar for a man at the print shop, a Bible cover for a widow who paid her with 2 jars of apricot jam. She never called it saddle-making. That seemed too large, too ancestral, too clean for what remained. Still, she kept a shoebox under the bed with needles, thread, a cheap utility knife. The lid had no lock, only a wooden peg turned sideways to hold it shut. She carried it upstairs before opening it, honoring a caution she could not explain. Inside lay a brass key and a photograph. The key was finer than the horseshoe nail key from the tin box. Its bow had been shaped like the craft mark, a crescent blade crossing a needle. The stem was narrow, the teeth unusual cut, not for a common door but for something made by a person with time and private intention. Age had darkened the brass to the color of old honey. The photograph was a tintype wrapped in a scrap of cloth. A young woman stood before the station in summer light. The roofline behind her was whole, the front sign clear of the walnut tree no taller than the chimney. She wore a dark skirt, a white blouse, and an apron marked by work. In one hand she held a half-moon knife. Her other hand rested on the shoulder of a saddle set across a wooden stand. Rosalinda nearly set the photograph down. The woman's face was not hers exactly. The jaw was stronger, the brows darker, the mouth more severe. But the resemblance reached across the years with a force that made the room go still. The same long shape of the eyes, the same left cheek slightly fuller than the right, the same way of standing with weight held over both feet as if ready to move, but unwilling to be hurried. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, Maria Elena Ibarra, daughter of Emilio, age 25, summer of 1903, daughter of Emilio. The son from the letter had returned, or at least his daughter had stood here outside this station holding a tool of the trade. The line had not ended in silence. Not then, not yet. Rosalinda sat on the floor beside the hearth with the tintype in her lap until the fire burned low. The brass key she placed on the mantel between the 3 blackened walnuts and the tallow candle holder. It caught firelight in a narrow line. She did not know what it opened. For once, not knowing felt less like deprivation than an agreement with time. The granite slab remained below. The key remained above. Between them, the house kept its own counsel. Spring did not arrive as a change of colour first. It arrived as sound. Snow retreated from the shaded places along the wash, and the creek line grew louder, with meltwater moving over stones and roots. What had whispered in winter now spoke through grass and mud, not a flood, not abundance, but enough. The cottonwoods took on a green haze at their tips. The walnut branches loosened their dark fists and began to show catkins small and patient trembling whenever wind passed across the rise. By March, the road softened in the afternoons. Rosalinda learned where mud held beneath a dry crust and where wagon ruts still carried water long after the sky had cleared. The station smelled different with thaw. Lime from the plaster, oil from the floors, cedar from the roof, wood smoke in the stones, damp earth below the cellar door. At certain hours when sunlight entered the south window and touched the tool roll on the bench, leather warmed enough to release its old scent into the room. She had thought during the hardest part of winter that spring would mean beginning the craft at once. It did not. The tools were cleaned but not yet mastered. The hides had been inspected, conditioned lightly, and stored in the cellar on raised boards away from damp and mice. The half-moon knife was sharpened, the awl polished, the stitching clamp repaired with a new leather pad. She could have cut into the old hides in March. She could have made something symbolic, something too large for her readiness, and called it inheritance. Instead, she chose not to begin that spring. Not the real work. She would order fresh scrap leather with 1 coin from the cloth purse, only 1, and keep the rest untouched. She would practice on small samples until her hands stopped trying to imitate Abuelito and began telling the truth in their own pressure. Straight cuts first, then edges, then casing, then a single borderline repeated until it no longer wandered. She would stitch weight-bearing seams on scraps and hang stones from them until the thread or leather confessed. The old hides could wait. The house had waited longer. Doris received 2 candles in April, poured into clean jars with wicks held straight by pencils across the rims. Rosalinda had rendered the wax from remnants and bought only what she lacked. The candles were not beautiful, but they burned evenly. Doris placed 1 on the cafe counter and lit it during the lunch hour, saying nothing when 3 customers asked where it came from. Caleb kept coming Saturdays. He split wood, carried water, and the unfinished strip from Abuelito's shed. Sometimes late at night, after Dale's television had gone silent and her mother's bedroom door had clicked closed, she took the strip out and ran her thumb over the marked but unpierced holes. The eviction came on a Thursday in September, though no one in the house used that word. Dale placed a manila envelope on the kitchen table beside Rosalinda's coffee cup. He had aligned it with the placemat. Behind him, and once spent an entire afternoon trying to plane a warped board because he had decided the station needed a better shelf near the hearth. Reverend Boyd still walked past each morning hat, lifting boots steady on the road. Everett sent word through Caleb that he had scrap leather in a box by the stove paid for already by someone who preferred not to be named. Rosalinda walked into town to object and found Everett writing in the ledger. Who paid a person with money? That narrows it little. It narrows it enough. She did not argue long. Pride was useful only when it guarded the right door. On the first warm day of April, Rosalinda opened every window that would open and let air pass through the station from front room to back. The new sash cords held. The old glass wavered. The patched plaster dried another shade lighter. On the mantel, the brass key rested without explanation. She took the unfinished leather strip from Abuelito's shed and laid it on the bench beside a piece of new scrap. For several minutes, she did nothing but look at the two pieces together, one marked years ago and left behind, one blank and modest waiting without demand. Then she picked up the awl, not to pierce the old strip, to practice beside it. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 1985, Rosalinda completed the first saddle that did not feel like an apology. It was not grand. No silver trim. No parade tooling. No florid skirts crowded with roses meant to prove what the maker feared could not be seen otherwise. It was a working saddle for a ranchwoman near Stillwater, whose old gelding had high withers, one white scar near the shoulder, and a habit of swelling his belly when cinched by anyone he did not respect. The tree was not made by Rosalinda, but she had chosen it with care, checked the fit 3 times, and sent Caleb to hold the horse while she watched the animal move under it before cutting leather. The skirts were clean and balanced. The fenders swung freely. The stirrup leathers were cut from hide she had bought herself, not from the old cache. The seat was plain-shaped, with water hand pressure and long patience. The borders carried one narrow line of stamping simple enough that any uneven blow would have confessed itself immediately. She stitched every weight-bearing seam by hand. When the ranchwoman came to collect it, she ran her palm along the edge, lifted the fender, checked the underside, and nodded without smiling. "Feels settled," she said. Rosalinda accepted the words as if they had been weighed before being given. After the woman drove away, the station returned to its winter sounds. Wind along the roof, fire shifting in the hearth, the faint creak of leather cooling on the stand. Rosalinda stood in the workroom with waxed thread still caught on her sleeve and looked at the empty place where the saddle had been. There was no applause, no newspaper notice, no crowd gathered outside the door, only the honest absence left by completed work. That was enough. The restored interior had not become a museum. It had become a room a person could live and work inside, without asking forgiveness from every surface. The front room held a table made from salvaged boards, 2 chairs repaired from mismatched parts, a narrow bed behind a curtain, and shelves lined with jars, folded cloth candles, beans and coffee. The hearth drew clean unless the wind came from the east, and even then the smoke only hesitated before rising. The floor had darkened further, with use the honey and mahogany tones deepening under boots' firelight and swept dust. In the back room the bench had been levelled but not replaced. Its scars remained. Above it hung the heirloom tools, each cleaned, oiled, and returned to work. The awl with the bone handle, the edger, the stitching clamp, the half-moon knife. Beside them hung newer tools bought slowly and paid for exactly a proper draw gauge, a head knife for rough cutting over stitch wheels, scratch, compass, maul, rivet, setters, punches, and a row of harness needles set in cork. The tintype of Maria Elena stood on a shelf near Abuelito's photograph. Between them, the brass key waited. For nearly 2 years, Rosalinda did not know what it opened. She tried it nowhere. It did not belong. Not the front door, not the cellar, not the tool chest she built from pine, not the old trunk Everett found for her at an estate sale. She let the key remain on the mantel through seasons of dusting, fire building, candle lighting, and work. Sometimes customers noticed it and asked. She answered honestly, "I do not know yet." In November 1985, after the first hard frost, the blinds held the morning in pale horizontal bars. Her mother stood at the stove turning a burner knob back and forth, though nothing sat above the flame. Rosalinda knew before she touched the paper. Inside was a typed notice giving her 10 days to vacate, along with a list of items she could take, and a smaller list of items Dale considered household property. The sewing machine was hers. The folding cot was not. The plastic storage bins were hers if emptied by noon the following Saturday. Caleb came to split wood and found a hollow sound in the walnut tree. He had grown taller by then, though not wider, and his voice had begun to settle into a lower register that still surprised him when he spoke after a long silence. He was clearing dead limbs from the north side when the back of the hatchet struck bark near the embedded horseshoe and returned a note that did not match living wood. Rosalinda. She came from the workroom with her apron still on. He tapped again lightly. The sound was not rot. It was space. They worked without haste. The horseshoe had grown deeper into the trunk, but on the far side, beneath a fold of bark and old scar tissue, was the edge of a brass plate nearly swallowed by the tree. It bore the same craft mark as the key, a crescent blade above a needle. The plate had a tiny keyhole darkened by weather and time. Rosalinda went inside for the brass key. It entered stiffly. She did not force it. She warmed the lock with her hand, brushed dirt from the plate with a soft cloth, and tried again. The key turned with a faint click, so delicate that Caleb, standing 2 feet away, leaned closer to hear whether it had truly happened. A narrow panel eased outward from the trunk, not cut into living heartwood, but set long ago into a dead hollow the tree had grown around without closing entirely. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a tin sleeve, lay a folded flag and a note. The flag was cotton, small enough to have been folded by careful hands into a square no larger than a Bible. When Rosalinda opened one corner, she saw 48 stars, not the flag of Tomas Manuel's war. Later, much later. The note was written in a woman's hand, firm and slanted. To the one who keeps the tools, my name is Maria Elena Ibarra. I am the daughter of Emilio Tomas Ibarra and granddaughter of Tomas Manuel Ibarra, who hid more than money in this house. I write in the winter of 1944, while the war has taken sons from farms, towns, cities, and kitchens all over this country. My nephew Daniel ships out in January, and my hands are too old now to make what I once made without pain, though I still mend when asked. This flag was given to me after my husband Joseph Alvarez died in 1918 while serving stateside during the influenza sickness that came with the Great War. He did not die in France, and some men made that sound smaller. It was not smaller to me. A uniform does not make grief more honest. It only gives the neighbors a shape they know how to salute. I place the flag here because the house has held what our family did not know how to speak. If you find it, do not make a display of it. Take it into daylight once a year. Let it breathe. Then fold it and keep it dry. The tools belong to work, not worship. The house belongs to whoever keeps it from becoming empty in spirit, whether their name is Ibarra or not. MEI, December 7th, 1944. Rosalinda read the note twice beneath the walnut tree, while Caleb stood beside her hat in both hands, though he had not been asked to remove it. The date held its own gravity. December 7th, 1944. 3 years after the attack that had pulled the country fully into the Second World War, with another winter still to pass, before surrender return and all the silences return creates in families who no longer know how to speak across what happened. They carried the flag inside together. Caleb did not ask to touch it. Rosalinda placed it on the table, let the warmth of the room ease the fold lines, then wrapped it again. The note went into the leather pouch with the first letter, not because the papers belonged to the same person, but because they belonged to the same long act of making sure someone yet unknown would not have to begin with nothing. The military medal from the first tin box had its own day. Rosalinda had waited until she understood enough to carry it properly. In 1986, on Memorial Day, May the 26th, she took the medal to the Churchill County Cemetery in Fallon, where Spanish-American war veterans lay under stones, weathered by salt wind, irrigation dust, and decades of sun. Reverend Boyd went with her, as did Doris, Caleb Everett, and Walter Pike, who said he had not dressed that early for anyone living, and saw no reason to start now. They did not know exactly where Ibarra had been buried. Perhaps not there at all. Perhaps far away, perhaps under a marker lost to another county, another state, another family's thinner records. so they stood near the veterans section where small flags had been placed at intervals, and Rosalinda held the medal in her palm. Reverend Boyd prayed without ornament. Everett removed his hat. Doris dabbed once at her eye with a paper napkin and then looked annoyed at the napkin for giving evidence. Caleb stood very straight.
The Heroic Veteran
Carmen
Dogs is
Ibarra
a fictional
had been
channel
leading her
created
whole
to
life
entertain,
without knowing it.
educate, and inspire the audience
She
by
first
exploring
learned
the
shape
deep,
of
loyal
departure
bond
in a
between
timber
veterans and their
apartment
dogs.
behind a
All
laundromat
channel
in
content
Stockton,
does not
where the
represent
windows
real
rattled
individuals,
whenever the
actual
freight
events,
trains
or
passed,
documented
and the
cases.
bathroom mirror
Any
showed a
resemblance to
thin
real
seam
people,
of silver
animals, or
missing
events
from
is
one
entirely
corner.
coincidental.
Her mother kept the place clean with a kind of severe tenderness, wiping the same yellow counter each evening until the formica shone under the fluorescent tube. The den would be converted into an office. On top of the papers lay one physical mercy, or something meant to resemble it, a $20 bill flattened crisp and held down by Dale's index finger. He slid it toward her. "You need to leave before your mother breaks." 8 words. They did not rise. They did not tremble. They sat on the table between the coffee cup and the envelope, plain as cutlery. Rosalinda looked at her mother then. Not at Dale, not at the notice, not at the money. Walter stared towards the road as if grief were best approached from the side. Rosalinda did not leave the medal there. The letter had not asked that. She brought it home, cleaned the ribbon as gently as she knew how, and placed it in a small shadow box Caleb built from walnut deadfall. Under it, she wrote only the name from the rim and the year. E. Ibarra, 1898. The cash money remained mostly untouched. In the first winter, she had spent 3 coins. 1 Morgan dollar for scrap leather and thread, 1 Barber $half when a storm delayed work and food ran lower than pride could safely ignore, and 1 Indian head cent that Everett insisted on accepting for a packet of harness needles because he said history ought to buy something useful now and then. In the second year, she spent 1 more coin on a bottle of neatsfoot oil for the first true saddle. No more. The silver certificates stayed wrapped in twine. The remaining coins returned to the cloth purse. After the roof chimney plaster windows and tools had been paid down by work sales and slow repair, Rosalinda resealed the money in the lead-lined tin. She added a paper of her own listing every coin spent and why. Not apology. Record. Then she placed the tin back beneath the floor near the mochila rack, not hidden in the same secrecy as before, but kept with intention. On the outside of the lifted plank underside only, she wrote in pencil, "For the next one." The shop did not open with a sign first. It opened with an index card on the corkboard at the Sagebrush Cafe. Doris pinned it between a church bake sale notice and a flyer for a missing border collie. The card was plain, written in Rosalinda's careful hand. Sand springs, leather repair, saddles, bridles, straps, cases, hand stitching. Leave name with Doris, slow work. Honest work. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then a rancher brought a bridle with cracked cheek pieces. A schoolteacher brought a satchel whose handle had pulled loose. A truck driver brought a Bible cover split along the spine. A woman from Fernley mailed a photograph of her father's saddle and asked whether it was worth repairing before she drove it out. Rosalinda answered each request by hand, keeping copies in a cigar box near the bench. By the end of the second winter, the mailing list held 43 names. Not customers in the modern sense. Names. People attached to objects that had outlived convenience. Mrs. Hollis, saddle fender repair. Jim Ortega, dog collar brass keeper. Elaine Price, Bible cover. Walt R. rifle, sling stitching declined because the strap was too far gone and unsafe. Doris menu covers paid in candles and pie. Reverend Boyd, hymn book hinge. Everett Morris, leather apron patch, no charge entered because the ledger between them had long ago become a conversation rather than arithmetic. Work came quietly. It left quietly. The station did not become famous, and that was one of its protections. In April 1986, Caleb arrived carrying something wrapped in a feed sack. He was nearly 16, then taller than Rosalinda, and embarrassed by it. The Schwinn had been replaced by an old pickup. He He was not legally allowed to drive alone, but drove anyway on private roads with his mother's stern permission and Everett's mechanical suspicion. He set the wrapped object against the front wall and stood with both hands in his jacket pockets. "My mother said I should wait until your birthday," he said. "My birthday is in October." "I know." He looked toward the road. "So this is not that." Rosalinda untied the feed sack. Inside was a hand-carved wooden sign made from 2 joined planks, sanded smooth but not too smooth. The letters had been cut deeply, then darkened with stain. At the top was the craft mark crescent blade and needle. Beneath it, in strong, uneven capitals, were the words Ibarra and Daughter's Saddle, Work and Leather Repairs and Spring Station. Rosalinda read it once. Then again. Caleb shifted his weight. "I can change it." "No. I know there is just you." "No," she said, still looking at the sign. "Leave it." The plural sat there with a quiet force. Not a claim about children she did not have, or fame she did not seek, or a future that could be ordered like lumber from a counter. It was wider than that. Daughters meant Maria Candelaria, teaching through darkness. Ana Lucia, stitching gloves so clean the damage disappeared. Elena, planting a walnut with dishwater. Maria Elena, standing before the station in 1903 with her knife in hand. Her mother too, perhaps, though that thought came with a bruise Rosalinda did not press. Women who had kept mended, folded, carried, endured, and sometimes failed to speak. Daughters meant the line did not have to narrow to blood alone. Her mother's hand remained on the cold stove knob. Her shoulders were slightly bent, and in the chrome edge of the toaster, Rosalinda could see the more distorted shape of her face turned away. No argument came. No correction. No hand reached for the envelope and tore it in half. Her mother lifted the empty kettle, carried it to the sink, and filled it though no one had asked for tea. Rosalinda took the 20 because hunger had already taught her the difference between dignity and theatre. Doris came the next day to see it hung. Everett brought screws better than the ones Caleb had supplied. Walter brought a level and insulted everyone's ability to read a bubble. Reverend Boyd stood back from the road, hands clasped on his walking stick. They fixed the sign above the door where the old station board had hung, leaving Sand Springs Station inside on the wall, preserved rather than replaced. When the final screw seated, Walter looked at Caleb. "That one's proud." Caleb sighed. "Pull it." They did. The corrected screw sat flush. The sign stayed. That summer, after the long light had gone amber and the first saddle had already been used hard enough to return for adjustment, Rosalinda began writing her own letter. She did not do it quickly. She chose good paper from the stationer in Fallon, not expensive, but strong enough to survive folding. She cleared the workbench at dusk, placed Tomas Manuel's letter to the left, Maria Elena's note to the right, and set Abuelito's photograph above both. The tallow candle holder, now empty, stood near the brass key. The flag remained sealed in its tin sleeve. The medal watched from its walnut box. She sharpened a pencil first, though she intended to write in ink. Drafting mattered. Words like stitches held strain differently when placed under pressure. The opening came because it had already been given. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote it and stopped. The room held its evening sounds. A moth struck once against the window and disappeared. Outside, the walnut leaves moved in warm wind. Somewhere down the road, Caleb's truck backfired and then settled into a rough idle. From the hearth came no fire, only the faint mineral coolness of stone at summer rest. Rosalinda continued. She wrote her name. She wrote how she had come to the station with no address and less courage than hunger. She wrote that the county had considered the building unsafe, which had been true, and that the building had considered her unfinished, which felt equally true, though no document would support it. She wrote the names of people who had formed the chain: Ellen Hardwick, Everett Morris, Doris, Caleb, Reverend Boyd, Walter Pike, the librarian whose first name she had eventually learned was Martin the waitress in Reno, whose name she never knew. She did not make herself heroic. There was nothing heroic in doing the next necessary thing because the alternative was sleeping in colder places. There was only endurance, luck, stubbornness, help received, help resisted too long, and work repeated until the hand became steadier than the fear driving it. She wrote the instructions she could honestly give. Do not cut old leather first. Practice on scrap. Keep an account of money even when the numbers shame you. Sweep before despair has time to settle. Never light a chimney you have not cleaned. Let old plaster show where it was mended. Leave some hidden things unopened until you have become the sort of person who can open them without taking more than you are ready to keep. She wrote of the tin box under the plank resealed now for whoever would need a bridge. She wrote of the granite slab in the cellar still not lifted. She wrote of the walnut tree, the horseshoe, the flag, the key, the sign, the tools, and the workbench that had held more lives than one. Near the end, she paused for a long time. Then she wrote the sentence that had followed her from the first cold night, through the discovery, the repairs, the shop card, and the sign above the door. Some trails are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. She did not know whether the next inheritor would be family. She did not know whether the station would survive another 50 years. Another 100, another winter as hard as the one that had taught her the roof. She knew only that waiting was not emptiness when something had been kept with care. A relay station waits. It has always waited. It waits for the next rider, the next letter, the next tired animal led in steaming from the road. It waits for hands quick enough to change a mochila, steady enough to mend a broken strap, patient enough to understand that speed and care are not enemies when both serve a purpose. It waits through abandonment, through weather, through county, notices, through boarded windows, through people who pass by and see only collapse. The Sand Springs station had waited under condemnation, under dust, under the long shadow of being unwanted. It had waited for a woman with a duffel bag, a work badge from a dead father, an unfinished strip of leather, and a name she did not yet know how to carry. It had waited without promising comfort. It had waited without making itself easy. She folded the notice once, then again, placed it in her bag, and walked to the den. It took less than 3 hours to sort her life into what could be carried and what would be left for someone else's definition of order. The shoebox went first into the duffel, then 2 changes of clothes, a coat, socks, a photograph of Abuelito at his bench, half-shadowed, one hand resting on a mallet, the folded leather strip, a church cookbook with notes in the margins, the cheap toolkit, a towel. It had waited, the way the desert waits, not tenderly, exactly, but with a dry, exact mercy for whatever can endure long enough to take root. Years later, Mrs. Hardwick still kept the extra $1 in her desk drawer, not in the cash box, not in an account. In the right-hand drawer beneath paper clips, blue tabs, spare stamps, and a tin of hard candies gone soft from summer heat. Rosalinda had tried once to return it, walking into the clerk's office with the bill folded in a clean envelope and the deed records long settled behind them. Mrs. Hardwick opened the envelope, looked at the $1, and slid it back across the counter. That one was never alone, she said. So the $1 stayed with the clerk. A small private record of a morning when a condemned building passed from public burden into patient hands. Sometimes when a new surplus notice crossed her desk, Mrs. Hardwick touched the drawer before reaching for the brass stamp. She never told anyone why. There are records counties keep in ledgers and records older women keep in silence, because not every true thing improves by being explained. The stamp still came down hard, received. The ink still settled into paper, and far out beyond the irrigated fields, beyond the cattle guard and the cottonwoods and the wash that could look shallow until water moved, the station stood with its cedar roof, its repaired chimney, its wavy glass, its sign above the door and the workbench inside, catching the first light of morning, a small envelope of cash. At the front door, her mother appeared with a paper bag. Inside were 4 tortillas, an apple, a bar of soap, and the work badge that had belonged to Rosalinda's father. Nothing was said. The bag changed hands. Their fingers touched for a fraction of a second, dry and careful. Then Dale opened the door wide enough for leaving. 6 weeks can teach a person the geography of refusal. Rosalinda spent the first 3 nights in Modesto, sleeping upright in the Greyhound station until a guard told her the benches were for ticketed passengers only. She bought a one-way fare to Reno because Nevada sounded open and because Abuelito's stories had always leaned east across the mountains. By then, she had $94, the duffel, and a blister under the strap of her right sandal. In Reno, she slept 2 nights behind a coin laundry on East 4th Street, where warm dryer exhaust made the alley bearable until the machines shut down after midnight. She washed in a gas station restroom, locking the door with her hip against the frame because the latch was loose. She ate crackers, a bruised pear, and 1 cup of coffee, refilled twice under the tired mercy of a waitress who pretended not to notice. The money went down by exact degrees. $79 after the bus, $71 after the thrift store shoes, $63 after a clinic visit when the blister opened and would not dry, $58 after peanut butter bread aspirin and a roll of quarters. She wrote the numbers on the back of the eviction notice because paper was paper and because tracking loss made it less shapeless. She took day work where she could find it. 2 mornings sorting donated clothes in Sparks for cash under the table. 1 afternoon washing kennels at a boarding facility outside Fernley. A long day helping an old couple move boxes from a storage unit, paid with $30, and a ham sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The woman noticed Rosalinda's careful handling of a cracked leather suitcase and asked whether she had worked in repair. "A little," Rosalinda said. "That is more than most people," the woman replied, and tucked $2 extra into her palm. By the 4th week, she had learned where not to sleep. Not under overpasses where men argued with no one. Not in parks after sprinklers came on. Not beside the river when the wind moved low and wet across the ground. She slept one night in a church basement after a volunteer with a silver braid gave her a blanket marked "Property of St. Mark's." She slept 2 nights in the women's room at a shelter where the lights stayed on and someone cried without pause until morning. She did not contact her mother. The number was in her wallet. The habit of wanting it was harder to discard than the phone call itself. Several times she stood near payphones with quarters warming in her fist, listening to traffic pass and people laugh outside convenience stores. Each time she put the coins back into the envelope and walked away. By early October, she had reached Fallon following a rumor of seasonal packing work that ended before she arrived. The town sat under a sky so wide it made buildings seem temporary. There were alfalfa trucks. There was never much money, but there were exact habits. Beans rinsed 3 times. Towels folded with the hem facing inward. Shoes placed toe to wall beside the door. Rosalinda was a child who watched hands. She watched the butcher wrap pork shoulder in white paper and make the string disappear under his thumb. She watched the neighbor Mrs. Alvarez mend curtains on her lap with the patience of rain finding a gutter. She watched men at bus stops smooth their shirt cuffs before stepping aboard. Low motels, irrigation ditches, and wind that carried the dry smell of alkali and cut hay. At night, the desert cooled fast, and she learned to put newspaper under her coat inside the duffel to keep the cold from climbing through her ribs. She slept behind a feed store one night between stacked pallets and a locked propane cage. Another night, a deputy tapped the sole of her shoe with a flashlight and told her she could not stay there. He was not unkind. He was not kind either. He waited while she stood, gathered the duffel, and moved along the shoulder with gravel ticking under her steps. The next morning, she counted $36 and some coins. The public library opened at 10. Rosalinda went inside because libraries did not ask immediately for proof of belonging. They asked only for lowered voices, clean hands, and the willingness to sit among other people's questions. The Fallon Library had a brick front brown carpet and a heating system that clicked and sighed in the walls. She placed her duffel between her feet at a table near the local history shelf and rested both hands flat on the wood until they stopped shaking. She read newspapers because they were free, and because classified ads were a form of weather report for people without shelter. Rooms for rent, labor wanted, estate sales, farm equipment, lost dogs, church suppers. A narrow column near the back carried county notices in plain type that seemed written for no human eye. That was where she found it. Churchill County surplus property. Disposal former relay structure, sand springs, vicinity, unimproved, unsafe, asses open. Bid minimum $1 buyer, responsible for removal, repair taxes, liability, sealed bids, due, October 17, 1983. Below the notice was a parcel number, a clerk's office address, and a line stating that the structure had no utilities, no certified water, no habitable status, and no guarantee of road access during inclement weather. Rosalinda read it once as information. Then she read it again as if it had spoken her name. Sand Springs. The words moved through her with the faint metallic recognition of a tool lifted from a drawer after years in the dark. Abuelito had said that name more than once, though not in sequence, not as a destination. Sand Springs Station. East of the Sierra and west of nearly everything else. A place where riders changed horses. A place where leather mattered, because failure could leave a man walking across salt flats with night coming down. She copied the notice onto the back of a library checkout slip. Her handwriting looked too formal, each letter narrow and upright. At the reference desk, she asked whether anyone could bid. The librarian, a thin man with a brown cardigan and nicotine stains on 2 fingers, adjusted his glasses and said county property auctions usually cared less about hope than paperwork. "You need the clerk," he said, "and probably a ride. I can walk." He looked at her shoes, then at the duffel, but he did not correct her. Instead, he pulled a county map from a drawer and marked the office with a pencil. Before she left, he gave her 3 sheets of scrap paper and a stamped envelope that had been misaddressed and returned. "For drafting," he said. At a back table near a window, Rosalinda wrote the bid slowly. She did not try to sound prosperous. She did not claim plans she did not have. She wrote her full name, the parcel number, and an offer of $1. Then she added, after a long pause, that she would accept full responsibility for the structure and any required repair or removal. The stamped envelope smelled faintly of dust and old glue. She slipped the paper inside. For the first time in 6 weeks, the act of writing did not feel like recording what had been lost. It felt like placing a hand on a gate. The decision to travel came without drama. There was no music in the library, no shaft of light, no stranger arriving with an answer. Only the clock above the periodicals clicking toward noon, the heat vent breathing under the table, and Rosalinda's thumb pressing the envelope shut. She had $36, no address, and a bid that any sensible person would have laughed at before turning away. But sense had not kept a roof over her head. It had not preserved Abuelito's tools. It had not made her mother speak. She walked to the clerk's office that afternoon and delivered the envelope through a slot in a glass partition. The woman behind the counter stamped the corner without looking up. Rosalinda watched the ink settle into paper. Received. 1 word. Exact and official. For the next several days, as if cloth could prepare them for whatever waited downtown. Her own hands were always being corrected. Not so much, her mother would say, when she poured salt. Slower when she folded paper. Cleaner when she washed a cup. Her mother did not mean to be cruel. She had been taught that the world noticed mistakes before effort, and so she taught her daughter to remove evidence before anyone else could see it. Rosalinda's father was a softened photograph in a shoebox. She remained in Fallon by means of small permissions. The church basement when there was room, the library when it was open, a bench near the courthouse when the sun reached it. She checked the notice board each morning, though nothing changed. On the sixth day, the woman from the clerk's office stepped into the hallway with an envelope in her hand and called her name as if it belonged there. The county had accepted the bid. There had been no others. Rosalinda stood with the letter open, the duffel strap cutting into her shoulder, and felt the strange weight of ownership arrive without shelter, without heat, without certainty, and without welcome. Somewhere beyond town, past irrigation fields and pale roads, and the patient reach of desert, a condemned building waited under a hard Nevada sky. She had bought a place no one wanted. At dawn the next morning, with the deed still unsigned and the desert road waiting ahead, Rosalinda folded the acceptance letter into the same envelope that held her last money and began walking toward the county clerk's office, where the first key to her inheritance would not be a key at all, but a warning. The first bus east left Fallon before the town had fully opened its eyes. Rosalinda boarded with her duffel pulled tight against her knees and the unsigned deed folded inside the inner pocket of her coat. Outside the window, the morning held a thin grey light over gas pumps, motel signs, and the long, low shoulders of buildings that seemed to crouch against the wind. The driver wore a baseball cap with a sweat-dark brim and kept one hand on the wheel as if the road were an animal he knew by habit. He did not ask where she was going until she placed her fare in the tray. "Sand Springs turnoff," she said. He looked at her once in the mirror. Not much there. I know. The bus carried 6 people, all of them quiet in the particular way early travel makes a person quiet. A man in a denim jacket slept with his chin against his chest. A woman with 2 grocery bags sat near the front and counted something in her lap. A teenage boy watched the desert through headphones with no music coming from them. The heater under Rosalinda's seat breathed dust and old wool into the aisle. The road left town by degrees. First came feedlots and equipment yards, then open lots with rusted trailers and cottonwoods stripped thin by autumn. Irrigation ditches cut dark lines through pale fields, and beyond them the land widened until the sky seemed to have more authority than the earth. The Sierra lay behind her now. Ahead, the desert lifted in low brown folds, patient and unreadable. By 9 o'clock, the bus slowed at a place that was not a stop so much as a permission. There was a county road sign leaning slightly west, a wire fence, a mailbox with no house near it, and a scatter of gravel where tires had turned around for years. The driver pulled the lever that opened the door. "This is close as I get." Rosalinda stepped down into cold air that smelled of sagebrush and diesel exhaust. The bus folded its door behind her, sighed once, and pulled away. For a few seconds, its red taillights floated in the morning like 2 small coals, then vanished behind a rise. She stood beside the road with the duffel strap in both hands. The clerk's office would not open until 10, and town was still miles back. She had taken the bus east only because the driver had told her at the station that if she meant to walk the rest after signing, she had better learn what the road looked like before she trusted it. So she walked the shoulder back toward Fallon with the wind at her face, one step after another, her shoes grinding pale dust into the blacktop's edge. It was 27 degrees when she started. She knew because the gas station thermometer outside town had said so in red numbers, and because the cold found the places where her coat lining had gone thin. Her fingers went stiff around the duffel handle. Twice she stopped to switch hands. Once she crouched beside a ditch and rewrapped the blister on her heel with a strip torn from the hem of an undershirt. A hay barn stood a mile beyond the last field, its doors gone, its roof patched with tin. She had slept there the night before, after misjudging the distance and losing the light. The barn had smelled of dust mice and last summer's alfalfa. She had crawled between stacked bales in the back corner, pulled her coat over her head, and listened to the wind examine every loose board. At 2 in the morning, coyotes began calling somewhere beyond the ditch road. Their voices moved over the land with a clean, rising loneliness, then fell away into the settled dark. By dawn, frost had silvered the straw around her shoes. Now, the kind with bent corners and a crease across one shoulder. His name was spoken in the apartment only when necessary, and even then with the care people use around sleeping infants. He had been a diesel mechanic, broad across the back, careful with engines, and gone before she was old enough to remember the weight of him lifting her from a crib. What remained of him was a smell her mother once described without meaning to orange hand cleaner, metal filings and winter rain on cotton. Walking back into town, she could feel that night still inside her knees. Fallon received her without ceremony. The first sign of town was a Chevron station with 2 pumps, a rack of oil cans, and a tired flag snapping on a short pole. Then came Lou's barber shop with a red and white pole that did not turn. Across the street, the Churchill County feed and seed had burlap sacks stacked behind the window and a painted rooster fading on the glass. Farther in stood the Sagebrush Cafe, open and smelling of bacon through the door seam. Then the Rialto Theatre with 3 missing bulbs in its marquee, and Morris Hardware, where shovels, stovepipe rope, and snow shovels leaned in the front display like tools waiting for weather. Rosalinda noticed them all because hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty make a person count the world by useful things. Food, heat, nails, news, a place to sit, a place to ask without being laughed out the door. She reached the courthouse block a little after 10. The building was modest and square with tan brick narrow windows and a set of concrete steps worn darker at the center by decades of boots. A juniper grew near the entrance, trimmed into a blunt cone, its needles holding beads of frost in the shaded places. Inside the hallway smelled of paper floor wax and the faint mineral scent of old radiators. The county clerk's office stood behind a glass partition divided by wooden frames. A bell on the door gave one careful sound when she entered. There were metal filing cabinets along the back wall, a calendar with a photograph of La Hontan Reservoir, and a brass stamp on the counter beside a black ink pad. The stamp had a heavy handle polished by use. It looked older than most of the room. Behind the counter sat the woman who had called Rosalinda's name the day before. Her hair was the color of steel wool, pinned into a low coil that did not seem likely to loosen under any force short of weather. She wore a green cardigan over a white blouse, and reading glasses hung from a gold chain against her chest. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Ellen P. Hardwick, County Clerk, with the letters engraved in black on cloudy plastic. She looked up from a ledger. "You came back?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Hardwick did not smile, though there was no coldness in her face. She opened a folder and placed several pages on the counter, aligning them with the same exact care Dale had used with the envelope, though here the gesture seemed born of duty rather than control. "You understand this is an as-is transfer?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county makes no promise of safety, habitability, water access, title to furnishings, or structural integrity?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the building has been posted unsafe, and that anyone occupying it may be cited if inspection finds immediate danger?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no electrical service, no certified well, no septic approval, and no county snow clearance beyond the main road?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Hardwick turned one page over. "You understand that if the structure collapses, burns, floods, blows apart, attracts children, injures livestock, or causes complaint, the county will not share responsibility." Rosalinda rested her fingertips on the counter. There was a crescent of dirt under one nail she had not been able to clean from the barn. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk studied her, then not rudely, but with a deliberate attention that made disguise useless. She saw the worn coat, the chapped hands, the duffel tucked close to one leg. She saw the careful posture of someone trying not to appear exhausted. She saw, perhaps, the difference between a person buying property and a person reaching for the last dry stone in a flooded river. "Do you have counsel?" "No, ma'am." Do you have a contractor?" "No, ma'am." "Do you..." Do you have another address? Rosalinda paused. No, ma'am. The pause stayed in the office longer than the answer. Mrs. Hardwick removed her glasses, rubbed one lens with a folded cloth and put them back on. Then she reached for the deed. Sign where I marked the blue tabs. The pen was chained to the counter. Its barrel had teeth marks near the end, and County of Churchill printed in gold letters worn thin by use. Rosalinda wrote her name 3 times, each signature slightly different from the last because her hand had begun to tremble. She signed the acknowledgement. She signed the liability release. She signed the tax statement and the notice of condemnation. She signed a paper confirming receipt of directions to the parcel, though she had not yet received them. There were no birthday stories about him, no favorite song, no family myth polished by retelling. Only a little packet of things her mother kept on the high closet shelf. The photograph, a work badge, a chapel program from the funeral, and a receipt from a tire shop dated 3 weeks before his death. When Rosalinda was 9, she climbed a chair to look inside, and her mother found her standing there with the packet open in both hands. The slap did not come. That was worse. When she finished, Mrs. Hardwick drew the papers toward herself, checked each line, then lifted the brass stamp. The sound it made was not loud, but it was final. A flat iron strike. Ink accepting paper. The county placing its weight upon a name that had not owned anything in years. Mrs. Hardwick opened a drawer and withdrew a map copied so many times that the road names had begun to fade. She marked a route in red pencil. Highway East, then Simpson Road until the old alignment breaks south. You will see a cattle guard, a rusted state sign, and a line of cottonwoods where the spring used to run fuller than it does now. The station sits about a 1/4 mile beyond that on a rise. Do not cross the wash if there is water moving. It looks shallow until it takes the road. Yes, ma'am. The clerk slid the map over, then hesitated. You are Ibarra. Rosalinda lifted her eyes. Yes, I had a Tomas Ibarra in here once, years ago. Mrs. Hardwick touched the edge of the deed folder, not looking at it now. Not on business. He came through with a man from the Historical Society. Asked whether we still had records of Sand Spring Station. Very polite. Hat in his hands the whole time. Rosalinda did not speak. He said his people had been connected to that route. Not a claim. Just a question. Mrs. Hardwick turned slightly, as if glancing toward a shelf beyond the filing cabinets. I remember, because he thanked me for looking even after I found almost nothing. Most people only thank you when you give them what they want. The room seemed to grow warmer around the radiator. My grandfather, Rosalinda, said. Mrs. Hardwick looked back at her with an expression that was neither surprise nor pity. He had careful hands. Rosalinda nodded once. There was no safe place in her mouth for more words. The clerk placed the signed papers in a brown envelope, then added a smaller card with office hours and an emergency number. Last she opened her purse, took out a $1 bill, and set it on the counter. Rosalinda looked at it. You paid with your bid already, Mrs. Hardwick said. The county has its dollar. I do not understand. This one is mine. The clerk folded it once and slid it into the corner of the deed envelope. For when someone tells you a place worth keeping is not worth the trouble. Rosalinda did not reach for it right away. Mrs. Hardwick's voice grew brisk again, as if tenderness had to be put away before it made a mess of the morning. Do not thank me. Just read everything before winter. Yes, ma'am. The bell gave its careful sound again when Rosalinda stepped back into the hall. Outside, Fallon had brightened under a hard, late autumn sun. Traffic passed in two directions with the ordinary confidence of people who had places to return to. She stood on the courthouse steps and opened the envelope only far enough to see the deed inside, stamped, signed, and bearing her name. Then she slipped the clerk's map into her coat and began walking east. The road changed as she left town. Pavement first, then cracked pavement. The houses grew farther apart with trailers set behind wire fences, cottonwood rows and fields cut low for the season. Dogs barked from porches and cattle pens as she passed. One yellow dog followed her for nearly 100 yards, keeping to the other side of the ditch, its ears lifted and uncertain. When she stopped, it stopped. When she walked on, it walked on until a woman's voice called from somewhere behind a screen door, and the dog turned back through brittle weeds. A pickup slowed once beside her, its window lowering halfway. "You headed out Sand Springs way?" "Yes, sir." "You got people there?" Rosalinda adjusted the duffel strap. "Not exactly." The driver looked down the road, then at the lowering sun. "Wind comes hard after fall." "I know." He considered that answer and nodded, as if it contained both foolishness and permission. "Stay off the wash bottom." Then the truck moved on, leaving a smell of exhaust and hay twine. By mid-afternoon, her feet had passed from pain into a flat, repeating heat. The blister had opened again. She stopped beside a barbed wire fence, sat on a stone, and changed the cloth around her heel. Across the road, walnut trees stood around an abandoned farmhouse, their leaves mostly fallen, their dark branches making a kind of handwriting against the sky. Beneath them, dry shells lay cracked in the dust. A raven hopped along a fence post and watched her with the solemn entitlement of an owner. She ate one tortilla from the paper bag her mother had given her and drank from a reused soda bottle filled at the library restroom. The water tasted faintly of plastic and chlorine. She saved the apple. The land grew more spare with every mile. Irrigation gave way to greasewood rabbit brush. Her mother simply took the papers, pressed them flat against her apron, and said, "Some doors stay closed because they have already taken enough." After that, Rosalinda stopped asking. The person who did not stop answering was her grandfather, though he insisted she call him Abuelito Tomás. His full name was Tomás Esteban Ibarra, born in 1918, with hands that looked older than the rest of him and a back that never quite straightened after decades at a saddler's bench, and stretches of pale sand crusted where old water had gone. Mountains stood low in the distance, blue at their bases and rust-colored where the sun struck the exposed ridges. The air held no softness. It showed distance without mercy. What seemed close remained far for half an hour. What seemed empty contained fences, culverts, tracks, old cans, broken glass, and the sudden movement of quail through brush. She reached the cattle guard near sunset. The rusted state sign leaned beside it, its letters weathered until they were nearly unreadable. Behind it, a narrow road bent south, two ruts crossing land that looked less traveled than remembered. The line of cottonwoods Mrs. Hardwick had mentioned stood farther ahead, leafless and uneven, marking water or the history of water. Their trunks were pale in the angled light. Rosalinda crossed the cattle guard slowly, listening to the metal clank under her shoes. Past the cottonwoods, the road lifted. The relay station appeared not all at once but by fragments. First a roofline broken against the sky. Then the end of a chimney, darker than the wall below it. Then the long face of a low building made from weathered stone mud mortar and heavy timbers that had silvered where sun and wind reached them. It sat on a shallow rise above the wash, facing what had once been a route of speed and dust and hooves. The building was smaller than the word station had made it seem, about 40 feet long and 18 feet deep, with a front room, a rear workroom, and a shed-roofed lean-to collapsed on the west side. The roof was cedar shake under later sheets of corrugated tin, some of it peeled upward like the lid of a sardine can. The chimney rose from the north wall in uneven brick, its top missing several courses. A faded board hung above the front opening by one iron strap. Sand Springs Station. The letters had been painted long ago in black, then repainted in red, then left to sundust and winter until they seemed less written than remembered. Near the door, half buried in dirt, lay a stamped tin plate greened at the edges and bent across one corner. Rosalinda crouched and brushed it with her sleeve. Sand Springs. Station 1861. She held the plate in both hands for a moment, feeling the stamped letters through the cloth of her glove. Then she leaned it carefully against the wall beside the doorway, as if returning a name to its threshold. The door itself hung from one hinge. It was made of vertical planks, each wide enough to have come from a tree. No modern lumberyard would have wasted on a door. The latch was gone. A strip of rawhide, hardened and cracked, still clung to one nail near the frame. When Rosalinda pushed the door dragged over grit and opened with the long complaint of wood that had not expected company. The smell came first: cold dust, mouse droppings, old ash. Dry leather so faint she almost believed memory had invented it. Under that lay stone bird feathers, sun-baked wood, and the bitter mineral scent of alkali carried in through every seam. She stood at the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The front room had a packed earth and plank floor, warped in places where weather had entered. 2 windows faced the road, both boarded from the inside with mismatched lumber. Light came through narrow gaps and fell in pale bars across the floor. A stone hearth occupied the north wall, its firebox choked with bird nest soot and a tumble of broken brick. Near the west side stood an empty rack built of upright posts and crosspieces worn smooth in the middle as if straps or bags had hung there and swung with the urgency of changing hands. The mochila rack. She knew the word because Abuelito had spoken it with reverence. Not a saddlebag, not exactly. A leather cover with pockets for mail, thrown over one saddle and stripped to the next horse, in a motion meant to save minutes where minutes mattered. Rosalinda walked toward it and touched the upper rail. The wood was cold. The back room was darker and narrower, reached through a low opening framed by hand-hewn beams. Here the air held more of the iron smell of work. Against one wall stood a bench, bowed but upright, its surface scarred by cuts, burns, and black rings, where hot metal may once have rested. Pegs remained in the wall above it, though whatever had hung there was gone. A forge pan cracked through the middle sat beneath a hood of rusted tin. In one corner, a broken barrel held fragments of horseshoe square nails and a handle from a tool long separated from its purpose. There was no bed, no stove beyond the dead hearth, no chair that would hold weight, no cupboard with forgotten tins of food, no lamp waiting to be lit. Only the building itself emptied nearly to bone. He lived in a narrow house in Modesto, with grapevines wired along the side fence and a shed behind the kitchen where the air was always warm with leather beeswax and the dry mineral dust of sharpening stones. On Saturdays, her mother put Rosalinda on the Greyhound before sunrise with a paper bag, lunch exact fare, and the warning to keep both feet under her own seat. Abuelito waited at the station wearing a grey felt hat and a shirt buttoned to the throat, even in August. He did not wave much. She set the duffel near the front wall and took inventory because fear became smaller when divided into tasks. Roof hole above the east corner. Window boards loose but usable. Hearth blocked. Floor uneven near the rack. Back wall damp at base. Door repair needed before night wind. Evidence of mice. Evidence of birds. No fresh animal bedding. No recent human tracks inside, except her own. Outside, the sun had dropped behind the low ridge, and the temperature fell as if someone had opened a cellar door beneath the desert. She gathered loose boards from the collapsed lean-to, choosing only pieces dry enough to burn, and not so rotten they turned to powder in her hands. She found a coil of wire half buried near the wall and used it to fasten the front door as well as she could, looping it through an old hinge strap and around a nail in the frame. The first night inside did not feel like rescue. It felt exact. She swept a place on the floor with a bundle of rabbit brush tied in cord. She laid her coat down, then the towel, then sat with her back against the wall while the last light drained through the boards. Her supper was the apple half, the peanut butter and water. She saved the remaining tortilla because morning had a way of arriving hungry. The sounds of the station came forward after dark. Wind pressed along the south wall, found the roof gaps, and moved above her with a low, papery flutter. Mice worked somewhere inside the back room, quick feet over dry debris. The loose sign outside tapped once, then waited, then tapped again. Far off a coyote called, and another answered from a direction she could not place. The cold entered from below. It came through the floorboards, through the wall, behind her shoulders, through the sleeves of her coat. She pulled the duffel close and rested one hand on it, not from fear of theft, but because everything she could claim was inside that bag. The deed, the photograph, the unfinished strip of leather, the little toolkit. The dollar Mrs. Hardwick had given her folded and tucked where no one could see it. Near midnight, the moon rose enough to lay a thin white bar across the front room floor. It touched the mochila rack first, then the warped planks beneath it, then the toe of Rosalinda's shoe. In that cold light, the room no longer seemed empty. It seemed withheld. She did not pray in words. She did not make promises to the building, or to Abuelito, or to any ancestor whose name had thinned over time. She simply reached into the duffel, drew out the folded leather strip from the shed in Modesto, and placed it beside her on the floor. The leather had kept its old marks, unpierced holes, a line waiting for thread. Rosalinda lay down with her coat over her chest and the duffel under her head. The station creaked in the wind. The desert held its silence around the walls. Somewhere under the floorboards, under dust, under the patience of years, something stayed hidden and dry. Some trails are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. By morning, the water bottle had frozen cloudy at the shoulder. Rosalinda woke before sunrise with the kind of cold that made every joint seem separate from the next. Her breath had silvered the inside of her coat collar. The floor beneath her hip felt harder than stone, and for several seconds she did not move, listening to the station answer the first wind of day. The door wire held. The roof muttered. Somewhere inside the wall, a mouse made one brief offended sound and went still. She sat up slowly. The first task was water. Mrs. Hardwick's map had shown the old spring line in red pencil, but the clerk's warning had been exact enough to keep Rosalinda from trusting it without proof. She walked out with the bottle under one arm and followed a shallow trace through rabbit brush toward the cottonwoods. The ground there changed before the water appeared. Alkali crust gave way to darker soil. Tufts of grass bent under frost. A narrow runnel moved between stones, not enough to sing, but enough to prove the place had not entirely forgotten its name. She crouched and watched the water for a long time. It slid clear over black leaves, then disappeared into a cut bank where roots held the earth together. She did not drink at once. Abuelito had taught her that wanting a thing did not make it safe. She filled the bottle, carried it back, and boiled what she could in a dented coffee can she had found behind the forge pan. The first taste was tinny with a trace of mud, but it was warm, and warmth could pass for grace before noon. The outhouse stood 30 yards behind the station, tilted toward the wash, like a tired man listening for weather. Its door was gone, and half the seat had cracked through. She found 2 boards in the collapsed lean-to, wedged them across the broken place.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.